In 2004, California-based video game developer Troika Games released Vampyr the Masquerade, Bloodlines. The game reviewed well, but sold horrendously, and within 4 months, the studio had laid off all of their staff and ceased operation. Development had been tremendously expensive, and Activision, the game's publisher, failed to market Bloodlines effectively. The game quickly garnered a reputation for crashing, among a multitude of other technical issues, which made choosing between Bloodlines and the glistening polish of Valve's Half-Life 2, a title that was released on the same day, easy for consumers at the time. Despite all of this, however, Bloodlines has managed to earn a cult audience that has softened its reputation over the years. That improvement of reputation has been so dramatic that Bloodlines frequently receives glowing retrospective analyses, high placements on lists of the best video game RPGs ever made, and is often name-dropped by many high-profile developers as a key piece of inspiration behind their current projects. There are multiple YouTube review videos that have the word masterpiece in the title, which is a level of glazing nobody would have entertained on release. But as time has passed, and more games proudly wear their Bloodlines inspiration openly, I wonder about the longevity and return of this kind of design. Vampyr the Masquerade Bloodlines is among a subgenre of RPGs often referred to as immersive sims, games that place a heavy emphasis on providing the player the tools to overcome challenges however they choose, rather than the developer dictating how a scenario should play out. Developing freeform gameplay tools and a world that could react to those tools was an extremely arduous process, and not only cost the staff of Troika Games their studio, but those working at Looking Glass Studios and Ion Storm wouldn't be employed there when their games attained their now legendary status. Development of this style of game hasn't been sustainable. Will modern studios creating Bloodlines-inspired games persist to enjoy the fruits of their labor? Could these studios simply be citing Bloodlines as inspiration for association reasons, hoping to draw in potential customers with the promise of emulating something they are familiar with? Has every game that featured vampires throughout the last 20 years been chasing Bloodlines' clout this entire time? Or are they too seeking a chance at immortality?
A chance at immortality is not a bad deal. And that's just for starters. Fringe benefits for joining the club. Well, you can still be destroyed.
This video aims to pick through all of the pieces that led to the current perception of Vampyr the Masquerade Bloodlines, where the game originated, who made it, the circumstances of its turbulent release, and the game's post-release legacy. It will contain a perusal of the tabletop role-playing game, an examination of Nihilistic Software's Vampyr the Masquerade Redemption, a short biography of Troika Games and some of their key staff members, a look at the first 2 Half-Life games, a review of Bloodlines, and finally a leaf through a number of games that are either directly related to the World of Darkness franchise or appear to be inspired by Bloodlines. There will be a literary and narratological focus, but the ludology will not be neglected. Similarly, Vampyr the Masquerade is hyper-political by nature.
Of course, you need a constant supply of some meat-eat blood, or she'll fall apart faster than Thatcher's reforms.
There's an entirely segregated vampire society. The members of that society spend considerable time playing political games with each other, and the franchise routinely represents real-world political strife. A lot of the time, there isn't much in the way of subtext to read into. It is all just text. And I'd argue it isn't text that has had too much thought put into what it's espousing, but we'll get into that later. If you are sensitive to spoilers for any of the games that I mentioned by name earlier, you have had 20 years to play these games. Go and play them and then come back. First released in 1991, Vampyr the Masquerade is a tabletop role-playing game created by Mark Rein-Hagen and originally published by White Wolf Publishing. Much like Dungeons & Dragons, Vampyr the Masquerade sees a group of players be led by a storyteller through an adventure within the World of Darkness universe. Each player creates a character to roleplay. They use dice and numerical stats to determine how the events in the story play out, And all the while, the storyteller employs pieces of the setting to continue the intrigue while also ensuring the plot moves forward. The underlying gameplay system introduced in Vampyr the Masquerade was named the Storytelling System. It was an adaptation of the system present in Reynhagen's previous game, Ars Magica, and it would go on to be the basis for all 8 core rulebooks within the World of Darkness franchise, as well as each of their subsequent editions, and a handful of other games that licensed the system. While the primary gameplay of these World of Darkness titles was facilitating player-driven storytelling, Reynhagen and the other writers of each entry maintained an overarching plot that would eventually bring Gehenna to the World of Darkness, ending the series in 2004. Even immortal creatures are susceptible to an apocalypse. As much as I would have liked to end the introduction to the World of Darkness here, and moved on to talking about Vampyr the Masquerade in particular, those familiar with the matter will know that I'd be neglecting something important. In 2018, a 5th edition of the Vampyr the Masquerade core rulebook was released. It was the first entry to be published since the 20th anniversary edition in 2011, and it was the first to be released under White Wolf's new owners, Paradox Interactive. In the time between the Gehenna event in 2004 and Paradox's acquisition of White Wolf, Reynhagen had left the studio, and a number of other key staff members broke away to establish an independent publishing business called Onyx Path. Paradox arranged for Reynhagen to return to assist in the creation of what would become known as V5, but the bulk of the development team was relatively junior and looking to make a name for themselves. Vampyr the Masquerade has always reveled in being shamelessly edgy. The books are filled with images of brooding trench coats draped in shadow, intricate descriptions of religious conspiracies, and actual Joy Division lyrics. In the 2nd edition rulebook, there is a passage about how the American CDC had become deeply concerned over the increasing incidence of AIDS transmissions outside of sexual contact by vampires. The AIDS epidemic was and has continued to be a very real and very horrific problem. Fear over non-sexual transmissions of the virus has been a regular justification for extreme acts of homophobia, and I think it is unwise to toy with this topic for the sake of some throwaway world-building fluff. Unfortunately, the team that developed V5 felt differently. The controversial decisions began with an alpha playtest release of the game making its way onto the internet. One of the example characters within this test was said to love the young, which is extremely suspect and has been deliberately left open for the worst possible interpretations. Later, an article posted to the website dogwithdice.com gained some attention for pointing out how little effort had been made in countering the inherent fascism of role-playing as a vampire. The adage, by becoming a monster, one learns what it means to be human, no longer appeared to be the tragic principle behind the game. Instead, players were being encouraged to be monsters. Defraud your own company. Pirate movies. Become a neo-Nazi. The developers failed to divest themselves from these accusations, likely emboldened by the Gamergate movement and Reynhagen's pathetic lie down and let the Nazis stomp on you response to the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. There is some level of inanity to allowing your work to be painted with Nazi sympathies, but the worst of it was yet to come. In a supplemental book released shortly after the 5th edition core rulebook, the tortures and murders of over 100 people at the hands of the Chechen government in a series of anti-gay purges in 2017 was written to be some kind of justifiable upholding of the masquerade by the vampires in the region. Actual people were being abducted, tortured, and murdered by their own government on suspicion of being gay, and this disgusting pattern of homicidal bigotry was deemed appropriate to riff on for a silly vampire role-playing game. Almost the entire development staff was fired as a result of these events, and Paradox Interactive have disallowed White Wolf to ever work on anything independently again. Reynhagen's attitude seems to have massively improved in recent years, although he tends to keep his head down. The rights to the storytelling system and World of Darkness now lie with Onyx Path, who have scaled back to a print-on-demand business model. new World of Darkness books could surface at any time, but there is enough storytelling material for us to analyze already. For this section, I'll be referring to my copy of the 2nd edition rulebook. Later editions might have changed the more niche rulings within the book, expanding or reducing the number of abilities a character might have, changing what those abilities are and which attributes they fall beneath, perhaps even altering the way dice results are handled, but I don't think the fundamental components of the game have changed that much throughout its evolution. When Games Workshop released the 8th edition of Warhammer 40,000, which was shit, players continued to move pieces around on a table and roll dice to attack, and Vampire the Masquerade is a considerably less rules-based game than 40k could ever be. Players create characters that are people first and gameplay pieces second. The person they invent informs where the stat points are assigned. Points can be assigned anywhere within 3 major categories that include attributes, the underlying aptitudes of a character, abilities, a character's specific skills or knowledge, and advantages, which function like casting spells. Invested points reward the player with additional dice when rolling to check if they can complete in-game actions that the storyteller judges. All rolls are made with 10-sided die, where 10s are always considered successes. A storyteller might test a character's linguistic knowledge, for example. The player has invested 2 points into linguistics and 6 points into perception, allowing them to roll 8 dice to attempt to pass the skill check. And as far as the book is concerned, that's where the rules end. Role-playing has been given a great deal of power at the table, and I feel for inexperienced storytellers trying to wrangle multiple players let loose to excitedly embody their characters. That being said, this system is more than capable of hosting RPG campaigns successfully, and it gives a lot of leeway for the video game adaptations to make adjustments to better fulfill their own narrative and mechanical ideas. Outside of the theming though, I don't fully understand how the storytelling system facilitates the vampire fantasy. When discussing a series of games that primarily concern themselves with providing the player the opportunity to roleplay as a vampire, I think establishing an understanding of what the vampire fantasy is will be paramount to the discussion going forward. We all know what a vampire is, but what does it mean to be a vampire? Bram Stoker's Dracula is an eccentric loner, a man who had managed to escape the bounds of a normal human lifetime and continue existing outside of the world they had once inhabited. Vampires tend to be ageless predators that feed upon us when we are at our most vulnerable, and because they are beings that prey upon humans, the top of all natural food chains, vampires must have supernatural strength and speed, and a hypnotic aura that prevents us from fighting them off. There is also an inherent sexuality to the vampire, entering bedrooms where they are not resisted, the biting of the neck, the lustful compulsion to use a person to the fullest. Vampires, in many ways, are better than normal humans. They're stronger, faster, more attractive, and exist outside of natural hierarchy and societal norms. This is where the innate fascism of the vampire fantasy lies. A race above, a chosen people who are simply better due to fundamental characteristics, living in apartheid, and the power to enslave the underclass persistent within their blood. If the writers do not sufficiently emphasize the vampire's flaws, then their fantasy is just supremacism. What it would mean to be a vampire would simply be that the person is better than all others, and aside from that being pathetic and despicable, it also isn't very interesting. The second edition of Vampire the Masquerade excellently accentuates the vampire's evils and tragedies. In order to sustain oneself, a vampire must hunt and feed upon people, and the game frames that as a brutal but necessary cannibalism. The vampire's agelessness requires them to step away from their life before the embrace. Immortality is useful, but having to watch loved ones wither and die would be a horrible nightmare. And, of course, vampires cannot go out in the sunlight. They can never again see the sun rise or set, or feel its warmth upon their skin. They are functionally imprisoned by the night, which makes traveling long distances nearly impossible. Vampire the Masquerade has also included a humanity system that I think counteracts and disincentivizes the fall into otherness. As a vampire loses touch with their humanity, they will become more instinctual, poor thinkers, and less effective overall. In dire times, a vampire might succumb to their bestial nature, an uncontrollable state where their decision-making capability dissolves, and they act entirely upon instinct. This could lead them into danger, lashing out at their friends, or breaching the masquerade and putting all of vampire society at risk. One must maintain their humanity, else they end up becoming a monster. The morality of feeding on humans, coping with agelessness, and balancing one's humanity are all very personal questions in my mind. And while they are very engaging dilemmas to think about individually, Vampire the Masquerade is a social game? The book recommends playing the game with a storyteller and no more than a handful of players. But if everyone at the table is introspecting about their monstrousness, then how does the game progress? Characters in a Dark Eye campaign aren't overly concerned with their own existences. The party's Thorwalian physician isn't thinking about the morality of their actions, and they certainly don't need to step out of the room every once in a while to go suck a real estate agent dry. The nature of the setting lends itself much better to individual characters living their own stories. I love this example character sheet where the player has written loner as their character's nature. Like, yeah dude, you and every other person in the party. Now, are we raiding this Sabat base, or do you want to talk about how much you donated to charity after you bled that guy to death? Going forward, we will be evaluating whether the video game adaptations have effectively captured the vampire fantasy. Is the player character powerful but tragic? Is their connection to humanity tentative and wavering but recoverable? Do they exist outside of their original context? Do they have to feed upon humans, and are there more valuable prey targets? And are the adaptations faithful to the game they borrowed their name from? Vampire the Masquerade Redemption was developed by California-based Nihilistic Software and originally released in June of 2000. It was the first World of Darkness video game to be released, but Redemption was not the first to be developed. Multiple Werewolf the Apocalypse games had failed to get off the ground prior to Redemption's release. Capcom made an attempt, but wouldn't reskin nightmare creatures, a mistake as far as I'm concerned. And Dreamforge Entertainment's adaptation was thwarted when their publisher managed to go bankrupt despite having just released Sanitarium not long prior. It'll be a while before the first graphical video game adaptation of Werewolf the Apocalypse would release in 2022, so in the meantime, World of Darkness fans would just have to make do. And so, undeterred by the failures of those before them, Nihilistic Software went and licensed the Caradiant engine, brought Activision on board, and the young studio managed to release Redemption to a broadly positive reception. Unlike other tabletop adaptations before it, Nihilistic Software designed Redemption to be a more action-orientated game. Calling Redemption an action RPG would be a very liberal association of the label, but I'm not entirely sure what other categories the game fits into. The player character awakens in Prague after being transported back from the crusading front lines in current-day Czechia. Christoph's recovery is disrupted one night, and he staggers out of bed to discover that the convent he is being hospitalized within was being attacked by a group of Schlachter creatures. After successfully fighting off the raiders, Christoph resolves to clear all evil from the abandoned silver mine beyond the city's walls the moment he can stand, and soon enough, the player delves into the mine to see the mess these Schlachter creatures have made. Schlachter is a borrowed Polish term. These are invented henchman creatures created by one of the Sabat's feeder clans called the Tsumitsi, and I like the name. The real Schlachter were the Polish and Lithuanian nobility, whose existence was officially abolished over 100 years ago, so the name is absolutely up for grabs and nominally appropriate. In the deepest pits of the mine, Christoph comes across some kind of ritual site, and eventually meets Asjara the Unliving, a Tsumitsi vampire who thoroughly kicked my face in a couple of times. Her model is a true work of art. Upon Azra's defeat, Christoph is praised as a hero to all of Prague, and his reward is to be cast out of the convent and sent back to the front lines. The local priest dislikes Christoph's declaration of love for Anezka, the nun that tended to him, and forces the paladin out immediately so that she isn't diverted from her duties. That night, one of the local vampire clans decides to make their move, and Ekaterina of the Bruja clan manages to embrace Christoph and bring him into the fold. Establishing Christoph as a character first, then showing that he is a capable combatant as a human is an excellent introduction for him, and it adds to the calculated, ever-present, watchful characterization the vampire clans receive in Redemption. They're all very aware of the human population around them. They're playing political games with each other at all times. They're even competing to embrace particular humans in order to strengthen their positions. The writing might be difficult for the actors to deliver, but the broader narrative introduction is solid.
Therefore we are resolved to entreat Prince Rudolf Brandel for assistance, even though he is of Clan Ventru. To make amends for withholding this letter from thee, we go tonight. Come.
It isn't until after Christoph's embrace that the real meat of the gameplay begins. Initially, Christoph is paired with Wilhelm, a more experienced vampire who is itching for some action. The pair are sent to run a few errands around town that happen to involve plenty of dungeon diving, which features a fair number of combat encounters. Redemption can be controlled entirely with the mouse. Keyboard shortcuts have been relegated to opening menus at the very most. The player's party occupies a small window at the bottom of the screen, where the player can monitor their mood, health, blood supply, and Mr. Beast gauge. Stored blood is used to activate the abilities in the lower right, that includes a healing spell, and a variety of castable stat buffs and offensive spells. The blood used to activate these abilities comes from a number of sources that include vitae bottles and rats found in barrels and chests, to the handful of humans wandering around the hub locations, and even other vampires, which raises some questions. Members of the player's party can drink each other's blood, which is a fairly normal thing in the setting's vampiric society, though it usually comes with some form of debt or favor owed in return. But interestingly, the feeding ability can be used offensively as well. Draining all blood from an enemy vampire is an effective means of defeating them. They're locked into the feeder's grasp until the player decides to let go, which usually means their entire health pool. In the tabletop RPG, the act of completely draining another vampire's blood is known as diablerie, and is supremely taboo. As the Metallica lyrics above the passage in the book articulate, the act of diablerie basically transfers the soul of one vampire to another, lifting their closeness to Cain, and essentially ranking them up through the Camarilla caste system. The elders cannot abide this, and diablerie is often grounds for the perpetrator's immediate execution. In Redemption, you can just suck dudes dry and there aren't any consequences. Hell yeah. Otherwise, combat is entirely determined by the equipped weapon's speed, damage, and accuracy stats. This looks like a real-time combat system that a lot of RPGs were utilizing at the time, but there are a number of differences that tend to make Redemption's combat worse than its peers. I said that calling Redemption an action RPG was the most apt description earlier, because the combat plays more like A Link to the Past than any typical RPG. The character the player has selected will not automatically attack during combat. The player is in total control of their actions, which means clicking on the enemy every time you want Christoph to swing his sword. This is the action component. Every attack attempt is subject to all of the normal RPG stat rolls that determine if the attack hits and how much damage it does, but the weapon's speed stat determines how often a click will be registered as an attack. This click to attack system only applies to the character the player is currently in control of. Other vampires will join the party periodically throughout the game, and they will automatically attack the nearest enemy to them whenever a fight breaks out. If the player switches to control another character, Christoph will then start automatically attacking. Uncontrolled members of the player's party will also cast their spells and use the items in their personal inventories. This is pretty much a real-time RPG combat system, but with the downsides of frustrating micromanagement of a single character, it's all controlled with the mouse, and there's no pausing. It's bad. This is a bad combat system. A gigantic proportion of Redemption's runtime is spent clicking on enemies and watching attacks miss. The tabletop game acknowledges that some scenarios are going to be resolved through violence, but it encourages storytellers to try and steer players away from fighting. Whenever a fight does break out, it often only takes 1 or 2 decent hits to land before one side is begging for mercy. Sometimes a weapon has a special lethality roll that can trigger some gnarly instant kills, but these rarely activate, and the most stubborn enemies seem to be immune to the effect. I will say that switching from the Tremere heavy areas to dungeons with human enemies was bliss. Vampires should be somewhat challenging to kill, and I like the way the Tremere vampires can either start threatening the player to leave, else they get serious, or they start whimpering when they get low on health, but they take far too long to kill. And some of these dungeons are unnecessarily grueling. Toward the end of the Tzimisce castle, there's a fallen pillar the party must cross in order to proceed, and on the other side is a trio of vampires ready to cast a spell that maxes out somebody's beast gauge. Whoever's in front immediately loses control and turns around to bite whoever is directly behind them, meaning the player instantly loses control of 2 characters, and the third can't walk past to attack the Tzimisce that caused this whole thing. This kind of encounter design permeates most of Redemption's dungeons. The Setite dungeon, a series of Egyptian-themed rooms and corridors buried beneath a London brothel, is swarming with vampires that start each encounter by casting a spell that prevents the target from attacking. Later dungeons also feature enemies that cast these neutralizing spells, but by that point I was completely on board with the drain 'em out plan. Unfortunately, this isn't a foolproof strategy, and it isn't very faithful to the vampire fantasy at all, but I digress. Redemption's broad gameplay structure is very simple. There is a hub location to receive the next portion of the narrative, and there are dungeons to complete in order to unlock the next portion. When the player arrives in Vienna, they find a means to enter Count Orsi's home, so they might question him about a shipment of slaves from Prague. Orsi has the information Christoph seeks, but as a consummate businessman, Orsi is unwilling to divulge the information without something in return. Christoph agrees to Orsi's terms, and the party ventures into the dungeon at the Count's behest. Once the dungeon is complete, there's some dialogue that establishes the next objective, and the cycle begins again. The game repeats this pattern almost the whole way through. 4 total hub locations, 15 total dungeons, about 20 total hours of gameplay. And so much of that time is spent running through winding but linear corridors. Places that could naturally become mazes are present all throughout, but almost every single location, be it subterranean cave network or crumbling castle, or industrial smelter and meat processing facility, is a singular path to a boss at the end. No puzzles or mini-bosses guarding keys, just combat encounters back to back. By most accounts, Vampire the Masquerade Redemption is an RPG. That's what the game's Wikipedia says. It's the first genre listed on GOG. Redemption even managed to win E3 1999's Best RPG category. The game uses a fair amount of material from the tabletop RPG, so it should be possible to evaluate Redemption with that as a point of reference. Christoph Romuald is a complex character with straightforward motivations. He had joined the Crusades willingly, righteously stomping into Moravia to reclaim the territory in the name of Christianity. As a relatively wealthy Frenchman and capable combatant, Christoph's participation in the war did not afford him officer status, but he was well liked enough to be carted back to Prague to recover from a near-fatal wound. A poorer or less capable man would have been left to die where they had fallen, and their stay in the convent would have likely ended much sooner. When presented with the strife Aneska and the other citizens of Prague had been subjected to by the Schlachter monsters, the player is given the opportunity to choose to what degree passion motivates Christoph to action. Does he immediately charge into the monster's den, or will he wait until he is fully recovered? In either case, there is no question as to whether Kristoff will enter the Schlachter's lair. As I said before, this is effective characterization. We know who Kristoff is, and what sort of actions he is likely to take. While this first choice is quite narrow, it clues the player into what kind of person the protagonist is, and prepares them to choose between the options that Kristoff would produce. Another thing this introduction does is immediately fall into the patterns of exoticism that are present within the tabletop RPG. Redemption never explains why Kristoff had joined the Crusade, nor does it bother to identify who Kristoff is fighting in the movie or elaborate on why he's fighting them at all. He is simply shot in the abdomen by a man with tattoos on his face, and we move on to Prague. There is nothing wrong with having a crusading soldier as the protagonist, but the game will repeat this pattern later on when it uses an Arabic-sounding name for a villain character in a fairly ham-fisted way. I'd imagine White Wolf and Nihilistic Software had just heard of the Middle East, maybe sometime around the early 90s, and decided to riff on the culture they had just learned about. It's kind of Dune now that I think about it. Kristoff's character is deepened when Ekaterina embraces him and forces him to reconcile with the new reality. Vampires must exist separately from regular humans. There are consequences for engaging with them, and it is now Kristoff's responsibility to maintain the masquerade for his and the rest of vampire society's benefit. He disobeys, however, and visits Anezka in her room. It's hard to pass what exactly Kristoff was hoping this conversation with Anezka would result in. She repeatedly tells him, "I love you, I love you, I love you," while Kristoff yells at her about how he's an evil, rotten vampire now and all hope is lost. What this scene is supposed to be setting up is Anezka's decision to pursue a cure for Kristoff. She learns of his damnation and sets out to discover everything she can about vampirism and whether there was a means to return them their humanity. Ultimately, this leads to Anezka becoming the narrative's primary focus. As she is swept along by the various vampire factions throughout Prague and Vienna, Kristoff and the crew follow behind in hopes of reaching Anezka before something drastic could happen. Kristoff is strongly motivated by this, otherwise this whole adventure wouldn't be happening, and his devotion to Anezka is so powerful that Willem and Serena, a Cappadocian vampire who joins the party, choose to disregard the masquerade and help Kristoff in his search. The player has very few opportunities to steer Kristoff during the early stages of the game. In fact, the player can only ever choose to speak out of turn when dealing with the Vampire Prince of Prague, or they can choose to talk back to Ekaterina once or twice. Narratively, I think tracking Anezka through all of the different Vampire Clan facilities provides excellent opportunities to explain each clan's machinations and motivations, and the writers certainly use those opportunities well. The Tremere being weirdo magic nerds that are too antisocial to properly integrate into the masquerade is fun, and while they aren't friendly with the pubescent Camarilla, they also aren't part of the Sabbat, which adds some extra layers to the political situation. The Sabbat are still the main villains though, which is fine. Throughout Kristoff's adventure, the Tzimisce leadership have been working in the shadows to unleash something terrible onto the world. The Sabbat, as with pretty much every other vampire organization, is highly interested in locating antediluvians. These are supremely powerful vampires, often said to be the grandchildren of Cain himself, members of the third generation and the oldest living beings in the world, which makes sense given their name. If a Sabbat member were to successfully drain an antediluvian and gain their power, humanity would crumble beneath their feet. But as it turns out, the antediluvians are aware of the fact that they are being hunted, and rarely ever appear in a traceable location. As a result, the Sabbat have been gathering lesser vampires and valuable humans within Vyšehrad Castle, where they will be sacrificed to Vukudlok, a vampire trapped in a deep torpor, whose power rivals that of an antediluvian. With Vukudlok awakened, the Sabbat should be able to locate the remaining antediluvians, harvest their power, and bring humanity to its knees. And wouldn't you know it, Anezka, a woman who had devoted her life to God, a woman whose pure heart had unwittingly fallen in love with a man who also devoted his life to God, Well, she happens to be the perfect candidate for an unholy monster to draw power from. Anezka's adventure had drawn her too close to the Tzimisce, and despite Kristoff's efforts to catch up to Anezka and send her home, his efforts were in vain. In the depths of a crumbling Viscerad castle, with Vukodlok's awakening only moments away, Kristoff confronts a ghoulified Anezka. In the struggle for his beloved, Kristoff is crushed by a falling pillar.
These monsters.
I have a ceremony of resurrection to perform. Be gone!
Nay!
Wolves all about us! Release me!
Never. Nesca!
850 years pass. Kristoff awakens in a casket as the sound of Anezka's voice calls to him and requests his assistance. He breaks free from the wooden box in a storage facility in London. Confused and starved, Kristoff is certain Vukodlok is still moments from awakening. He needs to find his bearings and prepare for a world he could never have expected. There had been very little decision making up to this point in the game, and from now on, all decisions are reduced to the final confrontation. Provided the player can keep Kristoff's humanity stat from ever reducing to 0, they will at least be able to select whichever ending they desire. The only way to lower the humanity stat is to completely drain a human of all of their blood, which has been, and will continue to be, really easy to avoid. The adventure in London is very short in terms of narrative content, and mainly acts as a roundabout way to lead the player to New York with a couple of friends. Pink is the first vampire the player will encounter in the city, a classic British punk. Pink is abrasive, sarcastic, and dislikes Margaret Thatcher. I think there was a lot of potential for fun back and forth between Pink and Kristoff, but as the game goes on, a lot of these opportunities are squandered. All the humor is front-loaded, which makes his design kind of flat. The pair eventually encounter Lily, a Toreador who had been captured by the local Setite prostitution ring, and instead of immediately agreeing to bring her aboard, Pink calls her a Tory, which is funny.
She's a Tory, all right.
Quizzes her about cry 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 for some reason, and then tries to decline her assistance. He's similarly hostile to other friendly vampires the crew encounters later on, always using some kind of nickname to deride their entire clan, which, while very period-accurate British, isn't very punk. Unless he's supposed to be one of those punks the dead Kennedys were singing about. I haven't spoken much about the other vampires Kristoff can recruit to the party because there isn't much to them. Willem is assigned to Kristoff early on, and loyally follows him around throughout all of the 1100s portion while not really saying much. Serena is similarly assigned and manages to be more insignificant. Eric at least gets to be angry about the Tremere's attempt to turn him into a gargoyle, and Samuel gets to squabble with Pink for a bit before Pink's betrayal, but there isn't much else going on. There's no way to have conversations with these characters after recruiting them to the party. They're just in the crew now and become tools for Kristoff's adventure. Pink eventually reveals himself to be Abdul al-Hazim, master disciple of the Assamites. The Tzimisce had tasked him with wasting as much of Kristoff's time as possible, and with the death of the Giovanni boss, Al, whose name is written in lowercase for some reason, Pink decides that his job is done, and that there is no way for Kristoff to stop Vukodlok from awakening. And he's right. In the catacombs beneath a cathedral in New York, the Tzimisce have succeeded in their plans to awaken the Elder Vampire. Anezka's here too, somehow still alive after 850 years, attentive at Vukodlok's side in anticipation of his arrival. Clan representation throughout Redemption is a little strange. While I think Nihilistic chose the most visually diverse clans to be enemies, I think the Sabbat clans, the villainous ones, tend to be the ones with Oriental origins anyway, which is another criticism I should probably lay at White Wolf specifically. Kristoff is embraced by a Bruja vampire, which is the clan that used to call themselves Prometheans, and were once benevolent rulers of Carthage before it fell to the Romans. The other vampires that join the party are Cappadocian, Gangrel, Nosferatu, Toreador, and Bruja, whose origins are Venetian, Nordic, Roman, and Greek. Civ 5 levels of cultural diversity. The bad guys are all from out east. The followers of Set are Egyptian, the Assamites are from Afghanistan, and the Tsamitsi are vaguely Eastern European. Even the Tremere, who are not members of the Sabbat, originate from Transylvania, in Romania. It makes sense for there to be large vampire populations throughout Christendom. All vampires originate from Cain, after all. But I would have thought the creators would have handled the diversity issue with a little more tact after the thrashing White Wolf received over the Romani supplement book debacle. It isn't like the Gangrel are incapable of evil. They're vampires too. But they're not from the spooky communist side of the world. At least Vukudlok's design isn't racially coded. There are 3 endings the player can see when they confront Vukudlok, and they can choose whichever they like in conversation with the vampire, provided Kristoff's humanity is above 0. Kristoff can swear fealty to Vukudlok, succumbing to the vampire's power, causing him to drain Anezka to death, and forcing him to serve in the Tsamitsi's army that overthrows humans as the dominant species on Earth. Kristoff can drain Vukudlok to death, taking Vukudlok's place as the ultimate being and draining Anezka to death again. Or Kristoff can oppose Vukudlok and try to kill him in a grueling 2-phase boss fight, the second phase of which I was unable to see. Vukudlok can just one-shot anyone he gets into melee range of, he can heal himself, drain blood from the player, and spams an immobilization spell often. Seriously, I tried for so long to just see phase 2, and I couldn't manage it. I had everyone armed to the teeth with guns and rocket launchers, piles and piles of blood bags for healing, and more than 15 revival scrolls. I had killed every enemy I could find to squeeze as much experience out of New York as I could, but I couldn't even scratch the dude. The ending sucks anyway. Kristoff gets to watch Anezka die the nice way now that her supplier of immortality is dead. And all the while, Kristoff's appearance stat did nothing useful. Coverage of the game when it was released was happy to label the game as an RPG, but I think nowadays Redemption doesn't meet the criteria. The game lacks meaningful stat progression and management, and there are basically no impactful choices for the player to make at all. Redemption would probably fall into the camps of games like Bayonetta and Devil May Cry, except without the humor and fun action combat. But while it might fail as an RPG, I think Redemption adapts the spirit of the tabletop game exactly. Kristoff is the ideal Vampire the Masquerade player character. By the middle of the game, Kristoff's power far exceeds what he was capable of in life, but he experiences the pitfalls of that power through his struggle with his faith and his failed romance with Anezka. Kristoff takes time to lament his loss of humanity. While he almost never speaks with a mortal character after his embrace, there are multiple occasions where Kristoff will monologue to himself about the tragedy of his vampiric existence. And the game does make some effort to ensure the player keeps Kristoff from losing his humanity entirely. He feeds on humans remorsefully, although there are often enough vampires and blood supplements to get by for most of the game. And I think the place where Redemption succeeds most is removing Kristoff from his original context within the world. He had been a crusader, a warrior of God, and then that life was taken away. For some time he had lived parallel to the society he had once participated in, and then when Viscerat Castle collapsed, he then lived parallel to a society for which he was never a participant. Kristoff is really the highlight of Redemption. I just wish it wasn't such an awful chore to play. Vampire the Masquerade Redemption was received positively and sold surprisingly well, and Nihilistic Software gained significant notoriety within the industry with their first commercial project. Blizzard Entertainment took specific notice of the studio and asked them to develop StarCraft Ghost, an action shooter spin-off of the StarCraft RTS. Nihilistic spent nearly 4 years working on the game before Blizzard decided to move the project to another studio, and in the meantime, a new developer had acquired permission to develop the next Vampire the Masquerade video game. After the unexpected success of the first Fallout game, Interplay Productions encouraged Fergus Urquhart to establish a role-playing game division in hopes of producing more high-quality video game RPGs. In 1996, Urquhart launched Black Isle Studios as a subsidiary of Interplay Productions, but Tim Kaine, the creator and lead designer of Fallout, found the studio to be too limiting. Interplay wanted sequels and adaptations of Dungeons & Dragons, inspiring Kaine to seek somewhere else to express his creativity. Leonard Boyarsky and Jason Anderson would accompany Kaine in the spring of 1997 to establish Troika Games, a premier development studio that would gain a reputation for creating award-winning role-playing games. This studio's first project, Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura, certainly gained a reputation. While the game was positively received and managed to move units throughout September of 2001, the game quickly became notorious for bugs, compatibility issues, and for falling behind the rest of the industry graphically. Vampyr the Masquerade Redemption was fully 3D over a year earlier. Apparently, Arcanum should have been too. Regardless, Arcanum's sales performance was strong enough that Troika established a twin development system, with each half of the studio focusing on their own project. One half would work on something comfortable and familiar in the Temple of Elemental Evil, while the other team would try something more ambitious. Troika approached Activision for some financial assistance to accommodate their ambition, and the publisher's involvement would allow the developers to create not only the studio's first 3D game, but also fulfill a desire to move role-playing back into the first-person perspective. During the late 90s and early 2000s, game developers would often build bespoke engines for their games. Drawing 2D graphics on a screen was relatively simple, and as computing technology quickly advanced throughout the early years of the internet, a new engine for the new game made the most logical sense. 3D was substantially different though, and smaller teams began licensing engines from bigger studios in order to avoid the massive expense of creating their own. Redemption was made within the Caradian engine, which is basically a lightly modified id Tech 3, the engine built for Quake 3, and Troika decided to do something similar. Another studio was working on a first-person 3D engine that claimed to facilitate the most detailed facial animations possible at the time. Pretty much everything Troika could have wanted. Valve's Source engine would even feature fully implemented realistic physics, and capacity to receive updates remotely via the internet. After the universal acclaim Half-Life received, Valve were locked into making the sequel bigger and better in a way no other engine on the market was capable of facilitating. I think it makes sense to quickly discuss why Source is such a big deal, mostly because I don't think I'll ever find a good reason to make a standalone Half-Life video, but also because Source is a monumentally important piece of Bloodlines. Much of what makes Bloodlines great can be traced back to Source, but at the same time, a lot of the worst parts of Bloodlines can be blamed on Source. So, let's forget about vampires for a little while. Half-Life is a first-person shooter developed by Valve for Windows PCs. It was released back in November of 1998, and it was, as the story goes, a revolution for video games. Up to that point, the only games that really attempted to express any kind of narrative were adventure games or RPGs, and a lot of the time those stories weren't very good. The thought was that players didn't need to read through pages of dialogue to understand the context of the gameplay. The blue key goes in the blue door, and there are enemies between those two things. Easy. Developers at Valve felt that the medium wasn't being used to the fullest, and as huge Doom fans, they set out to capture the opportunity before them. The team opted to license id Tech 2 instead of building their own 3D engine from scratch, but in a 2001 interview with GameSpot UK, Gabe Newell claimed that about 75% of the engine is Valve's own code. The plan was to use this modified Quake engine to tell a linear narrative, where each level would immediately continue into the next. The gameplay would focus heavily around the narrative events, and Half-Life would forgo pulling the camera away from the first-person perspective for the game's entire runtime. The whole game is viewed through Gordon Freeman's eyes, turning the Black Mesa facility from a series of static arenas to places where the scientists lived and worked, and ever since, capturing the reality of a location has become its own form of review criteria. I enjoyed Half-Life. Considering Freeman never manages to truly escape the facility throughout the adventure, Valve did an excellent job maintaining environmental variety and regularly deploying new thematic level elements. The gunplay isn't the strongest, but the engine is trying really hard to make up for it by offering the player a depth of movement options and facilitating moving environmental components. Ammo is scarce for guns that aren't the SMG, and enemies don't really flinch when shot, so straight up fights could easily dissolve into strafing around while firing full auto. Fortunately, there are very few non-augmented fights against standard enemies. More often than not, there'll be a moving platform or a level hazard to avoid, or the enemies are teleporting around. I even thought the cliffside segment was fun despite it being a hassle to navigate. The last few levels in the border world aren't my favourite. I think the floating islands in space thing kind of throws away the whole labyrinthian world design. It also echoes the structure of the original Doom a little too closely in my view, and the number of enemies is far smaller than I think an invading army really should be. The boss baby fight at the end is also nothing special, but the G-Man's closing monologue is fantastic.
Gordon Freeman in the flesh. Or rather, in the hazard suit, I took the liberty of relieving you of your weapons. Most of them were government property. As for the suit, I think you've earned it.
Michael Shapiro did a phenomenal job with the delivery of Mark Laidlaw's tremendous writing, and if the game somehow hadn't managed to earn a sequel by this point, I think this 90 seconds really seals the deal.
That's why I'm here, Mr. Freeman. I have recommended your services to my employers, and they have authorized me to offer you a job. They agree with me that you have limitless potential.
And at the time, the idea of making a follow-up that meets expectations would have been nearly inconceivable. How do you blow the lid off a genre that you just finished blowing the lid off? While the main development team at Valve tried to come up with ways to broaden the scope of the next game and keep everything within standard computing specs of the time, Valve's corporate team began a practice that the company would become renowned for throughout the next decade. Half-Life's popularity and ubiquity led a lot of fans to develop mods for the game, many of which would explode in popularity during the early 2000s. The developers of the Team Fortress mod were the first to be hired by Valve, with the Counter-Strike mod developers joining the team shortly afterward, and then the Day of Defeat devs made their way into Valve's staff. With all of these competent programmers making their way into Valve's employ, it was clear that the studio was gearing up for something significant. The only way a Half-Life sequel could possibly live up to expectations was for it to be a bigger adventure, more thrills, higher stakes, a deeper and more complex narrative. And the only way to achieve that was for Valve to properly enter the 3D engine development space. By their own admission, Valve's Source engine was very much a branch of id Tech 2, and this has worked to the studio's benefit tremendously. Since December of 1999, id Tech 2 has been open source, meaning anyone from professional development studios to hobbyist game devs could read and modify the engine's code legally, and they could sell their creations without receiving a cease and desist letter in the mail. The accessibility of the engine allowed a lot of people to get into game development, and since Source spawned from id Tech 2, transitioning from one engine to the other was relatively straightforward. Source would also be modular, allowing developers to integrate middleware components whenever necessary. You might be familiar with the OpenGL renderer or Havoc physics, software that modern game engines are designed to accommodate, but weren't developed by the engine's primary developer. Source was built to play well with middleware products and other developers' code, and could also receive updates from over the internet. These aspects would make Source highly accessible to inexperienced developers in a similar way to id Tech. Later tools like Gary's Mod would add further accessibility options for aspiring game developers too, making Source the engine of choice for a lot of young studios' first projects. And even when it was in development, Valve were confident that their engine was robust and effective, and easy to learn. So when they felt it was ready to show off, Scott Lynch, Valve's chief operating officer, gave Boyarsky a call and invited Troika over to play. On that fateful day in 2001, Troika committed to a prodigiously difficult development. The engine was incomplete, the studio had no experience working in 3D, and Activision had their own expectations. It wasn't even clear what Bloodlines was going to be by this point. In an interview with Rock Paper Shotgun from 2009, Bloodlines writer Brian Mitsoda described the project as kitchen sink design. The game was going to have everything, and somehow be out the door by 2005. Troika weren't even certain of the Source engine's full capabilities when they started working on Bloodlines, but they pressed on anyway, and hoped the features they needed would download one morning when the devs at Valve got around to adding them. And in a lot of cases, they didn't. When David Mullick, an Activision producer, arrived at the Troika offices a year into development, he found that Bloodlines was still missing design plans for features the team had wanted to add. Entire levels had been half built in the hopes that something would come along to patch up the holes. Mullick had word from Activision to get the studio to set deadlines, to bring the entire staff onto the Bloodlines project, and have the game code finalized by September 15th, 2004. Activision even forwarded Troika some extra money in order to pay their staff for the exorbitant number of overtime hours they would have to work to achieve such a deadline. This extreme crunch meant a lot of problems for the game would receive patch-up fixes, or just be overlooked. And if Valve weren't insistent that Half-Life 2 be the first Source engine game released, Bloodlines would have shipped in a much sorrier state. And Valve's game was the primary target for the engine's capabilities. It's very funny how blatantly one-sided the engine's inclusions are. Half-Life 2 features a number of physics puzzles that ask the player to move items to change the weight of a seesaw, and later adds a weapon that allows physics objects to be used as projectiles. The tutorial explaining this feature is one of the most iconic moments in the game. Bloodlines makes use of the physics by allowing the player to throw items to distract enemies while in stealth. And it works, but it was such a low priority inclusion that throwable items are barely present in stealth areas. It's far better to cast stealth buffs and run to the objective before they wear off. Throwable items only exist to demonstrate the presence of the physics. Valve also didn't plan on putting stealth into Half-Life 2, so Troika had to implement obliviousness and alarm as enemy behaviors. Combine soldiers don't have many decisions to make, so Valve could get away with building in a limited number of enemy behaviors. I do think Bloodlines makes much better use of the engine's facial animation capabilities. Zoomed-in conversations and high-quality voice work make the Bloodlines characters hyper-expressive, whereas Alex seems to be the only character whose face shifts beyond a neutral expression. Which is a shame, because we all know how expressive Source can be. Half-Life doesn't have much time for the characters anyway, due to the nature of Freeman's adventure. The 16th of November 2004 was the day both Bloodlines and Half-Life 2 were released, but only one would go on to become a critical and financial smash hit. Valve managed to flip Half-Life 2's runaway success into the monolithic PC gaming storefront that is Steam, while Troika were unable to continue operation. Audiences were far more receptive to Valve's action-packed romp, and for good reason. Half-Life 2 managed to live up to the sky-high expectations Valve had set for themselves, And even 20 years later, Half-Life 2 remains impressive. The scale of the game is gigantic. We aren't limited to a single Black Mesa facility anymore. A lot of the game takes place in the streets of City 17 and the surrounding region. Each exterior environment has a massive object placed somewhere in the skybox to draw attention, impressing players with the grandeur of the world at a much higher resolution than before. The narrative has also been broadened. This isn't just a mishap at the lab. People's lives have been ruined by a dominating invading force. The Combine are here, and in considerable number. The introduction is phenomenal. The train station is laid out meticulously so the player can absorb all of the world building at their own pace. Then the objective is made clear when the player naturally walks into a caged area and is identified by the security camera. Never once does the UI interject to inform the player about what's going on, and if the player does manage to forget, well, there's only one way forward. Go that way. Freeman is eventually intercepted by Alex, the daughter of Resistance leader Eli Vance, and the pair make their way to a lab hidden conspicuously within the city. Despite Dr. Breen's insistence, humanity is suffering beneath the Combine's oppression, and groups are working behind the scenes to drive the invaders out and liberate the city. The plan was to use Dr. Kleiner's teleporter to get Freeman to the lab and hash out the plans for a full-on assault against the Combine, but the teleporter malfunctions and the player needs to get to the Black Mesa facility on foot. The following levels are some of the most intricate layerings of streets, apartment complexes, storm drains, and sewers I've ever seen in a game. These tunnels feel like they go on forever, but they've just been wound around themselves super efficiently. And that feeling is only strengthened by the airboat segment. There must be actual kilometers of storm drain and riverboating in this game. But while this is all very impressive, I do think it starts to drag. An entire hour in the boat probably would have been better spread across the game, rather than doing it all in one big chunk. I didn't find the buggy to be nearly as tiresome though, which I think comes down to a better picked objective. The boat leads to a place you need to go to pick up the next objective. The buggy leads to a prison break where Freeman becomes the Antlion Queen. The final levels in the battle-scarred city are great, and even though it's kind of low-key gameplay-wise, I really liked the interior of the Citadel. The scale of the building is fantastic, and seeing the cogs of the Combine war machine spinning cements the idea that this is an army that has come to conquer. Zen was mainly filled with wildlife. The Combine are not animals. Shooting the bouncy energy balls around was neat, although you can just gravity gun the enemies themselves to kill them, which is weird. Unfortunately, I really disliked the ending. I understand there's external media, and the 2 expansion episodes and other stuff that might make shooting the shields off a glowy orb cool in retrospect, but none of that stuff was present in 2004. It's a weak final boss, and the G-Man's closing monologue lacks the intrigue that made the conclusion of the first game strong, despite Shapiro's efforts. Like, yeah, he saves Freeman with this transdimensional time power because his employers have further need of Gordon, but the G-Man put the events of this game into motion. He talks like defeating the Combine in City 17 was worth a pat on the back at most, and that the next task is much more pressing. I won't get into it now, but we know that the next task is still Combine City 17 related, which to me seems like the same task. A cool bookending of the game is all the G-Man showing up here achieves. Narratively, it adds a bit more mystery to a character who was already mysterious, but as the closing remarks to Freeman's adventure throughout the game, it leaves a lot to be desired. 20 years later now, it's easy to see why Valve's game has the legacy and reputation it does. Very few studios at the time could have hoped to match Half-Life 2's scope and scale, and the achievement of those things were, in large, a result of Valve's investment in the Source engine. At one of the most consistently creative periods in video game history, Valve weren't trying to innovate gameplay in a radical new direction. They chose to make the biggest adventure they could, and it clearly paid off. But as successful as one studio's use of the Source engine had been, The engine itself certainly wasn't a guaranteed success. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines is an action RPG that follows the adventure of a freshly embraced vampire trying to earn their place in Camarilla society. The game opens in a theatre, where the city's kindred leadership have gathered to witness an execution. The player's sire is charged with the crime of illegal embrace and summarily killed for their actions. But the vampire prince of Los Angeles, LaCroix, chooses to allow the child to live. This is no act of charity, as LaCroix immediately sets the fledgling to work, sending them to Santa Monica with a list of tasks to complete. The Sabbat are trying to establish a foothold in the city, and the player is told to speak with someone called Mercurio to figure out how to dislodge the invaders. After some investigation, the player eventually makes their way to the warehouse the Sabbat are based within, and plants a bomb to blow it to pieces. While fleeing the explosion, a vampire named Beckett approaches the player, asking if they've recently started to feel an unusual sense of dread or pressure, and if they have any idea what might be causing it. None of the answers the player can give satisfy Beckett's curiosity. With that Sabbat business squared away, the player can make their way downtown and report back to LaCroix about their success in Santa Monica. It's here they learn that a ship had recently anchored offshore, and many suspect an item called the Ankaran sarcophagus is on board. The player is next tasked with making their way onto the boat to confirm that the sarcophagus is aboard, which it is. From here, the rest of the game's primary narrative revolves around a variety of interested parties trying to get their hands on the esoteric stone coffin. Why does everyone want it? Who or what lies within? How the hell are we supposed to get it up the stairs? For the most part, Bloodlines is a very free-form game. NPCs give the player an objective to complete, but how the player chooses to complete it can vary a lot. That Sabbat warehouse I mentioned before has a few different solutions depending on the way the player wants to approach it. You can go in guns blazing. Most of the security is human, so you don't need to invest too heavily into combat in order to take the place down by force. You could take the stealth route, either utilizing your innate sneakiness or amplifying it with the obfuscation spell to get into and out of the central office unnoticed. Obfuscation allows the player to walk through the open, but there are also side entrances and rafters to crawl around in to avoid detection. Some other scenarios that would normally end up becoming a fight can be circumvented through clever conversation choices or a feat of intimidation, although nobody in the warehouse wants to talk. And if things do turn into a battle, there are plenty of options there too. Players can use a range of guns and melee weapons that are found fairly often throughout the game. Unarmed combat is also a reasonable option, particularly when enhanced with extra speed or damage spells, but the experience investment doesn't scale into the endgame very well. I tried to play a boxer my first time through, and it all falls apart in the sewers under Hollywood. The evil Geodudes are whatever, but the Tsumitsu creations have a lot of health, deal decent damage, and have superior range. They're basically a gun-only encounter, and the arena you fight the first one in is clearly set up to demonstrate that. Also, PC game melee combat doesn't get good until a long time after Bloodlines anyway, so the relatively lackluster mechanics of the 3-hit combo not being super fun isn't a huge issue. The number of enemies that show up toward the back third of the game is a problem, however, and if the player's chosen combat style can't cut it by Chinatown, then the rest of the game may not actually be beatable. I quickly learned to drain every enemy to death whenever possible since, just like in Redemption, enemies can't fight back when there's a vampire latched onto their throat. Had I made better choices in the level up screen, I might have fared better when the endgame truly began. Upon selecting New Game, the player is given the choice to answer a cool questionnaire about the character they'd like to play, or they can go straight to the character creation screen and make the choices there. Each of the 7 playable vampire clans in Bloodlines has specific characteristics that are passed onto their progeny when the human is embraced, and these characteristics are reflective in the stats and abilities the player character begins the game with. Malkavian characters start with an increase in the inspection stat due to their hyperactive minds, while Nosferatu characters cannot use the seduction feat at all due to their unfortunate deformities. The Chosen Clan also affects the spell disciplines the player will have access to at the beginning of the game. Since Tremere are magically inclined, they will have access to a wider range of spells right away, while the Bruja clan start the game with only the most basic powers. There are almost 3 distinct playthroughs of Bloodlines which all diverge at the clan select screen, and I'd argue that a second playthrough as a Malkavian character is almost mandatory to properly get the full experience. Malkavians are cursed with a nondescript madness, a vague mental illness that causes them to experience the world and communicate differently than any other vampire clan. Every line of dialogue said by the Malkavian player is different from those any other clan can select, even within feat checks. And because Mitsoda knew the plot of the game prior to writing the Malkavian lines, he could hide details within the player responses long before they gain access to the relevant information. In the first conversation the player has with Jeanette, the Malkavian character will refer to her as the daughter of Janus. Janus is a Roman god, often depicted with a second face on the back of his head. This conversation happens long before the reveal of Jeanette's split identity, and the fledgling just calls her Janus because the Malkavian already knows. Whether the player catches on is another thing, and that's why I recommend playing the Malkavian character second, so as not to be spoiled if you do manage to decipher the dialogue. And also because now, since you understand, you get to be the one dropping hints for the other characters in the game about how their little stories conclude.
Oh shit, a Malkavian. And you ran into Nox too? You guys must have had quite a conversation. Not a working brain cell between the two of you. Oh well.
Mercurio is the player's point of contact once they make their way to Santa Monica, and after clearing up his business with the bomb makers by the pier, he points the fledgling towards somebody called Bertram Tongue. Bertram is a vampire who knows where the Sabbat warehouse is, and he knows how to access it. Mercurio doesn't know where Tongue is though, since he and the Baron of Santa Monica, Therese Vorman, are in the midst of some hostilities, leading Bertram to believe Therese wants him dead. So he's in hiding, and nobody knows where. But Therese indicates she might be willing to call off the feud if the player does her a favor. The Ocean House Hotel could prove a very lucrative investment for Therese, but renovation crews won't go near the place because of the haunting. Ghosts aren't overly dangerous beings in this world, but mortals don't know that. So the player is deployed to the hotel to find a way to oust the spirit. What follows is a shockingly effective horror sequence that still holds up to this day. The hotel is crumbling to pieces. The ghost throws vases and paintings at you. The atmosphere is deathly still, and the little newspaper trimmings are a great way of telling the story of the haunting. It's almost strange how unexpectedly good this section is, because the rest of the game is full of horror themes. Everybody you speak to is a vampire, yet the horror atmosphere doesn't really reappear for the rest of the game. This talk to NPCs and then dive into separate combat segment structure will persist throughout the rest of the game though. Ghost busing isn't all there is to do in Santa Monica, as the player should come across a group of vampires hanging out at the beach below the pier. The assortment of characters is a bit unusual, but the shirtless Australian guy named E explains that this is a group of outcasts. Thin Bloods is the word he uses, although E doesn't really understand what the term means or why it applies to them. He thinks his sire would have answers, but he chased Lily away the moment she sired him, and she hasn't been back. So, while the hunt for Bertram Tongue is on, the player can also take up another missing vampire case for an engaging side quest that offers some interesting world building. The appearance of these thin-blooded vampires is cause for concern among some of the more traditional among LA's kindred leadership. Apparently, the vampire lineage eventually runs out of potency, and soon the latest generations will be indistinguishable from regular humanity. Older vampires see this as a crisis, a Forsaken-level extinction event that threatens to bring an end to the subspecies. Beckett is interested to hear of their presence, but doesn't necessarily view their coming as an apocalyptic signifier, only a curiosity. His perspective is wholly neutral, which complicates how I personally feel about Beckett. Neutrality means that you don't really care, and the struggle goes on even when you're not there. I like that there are differing opinions on complex topics in this game. There are levels of nuance within the game's own setting that characters disagree on, which is not a thing many other settings bother to include. The search for Lily will point the player towards the bondsman, who begins a quest to hunt down another person in Santa Monica. Arthur Kilpatrick's bounty hunter hasn't shown up to work for a couple of days, and the case he has been working on is still open to complete. This is one of a handful of quests available at the start of the game that takes place throughout multiple hub areas, which is a solid way to tie the areas together. All of Bloodlines is supposed to take place in Los Angeles, and without quests like this, I think the world would feel much more disconnected. The main quest also sends the player back and forth between the hub locations too, which is some fantastic world and quest design. And the Santa Monica quests make sure to get as much out of the hub world as possible. Eventually, the player will end up in the local medical facility. There's a blood bank on the lower floor, a secure area on the top floor, and a clinic in the middle. Lily is being held prisoner here by the nurse manning the blood bank. Vandal's a bit of a psychopath who's enacting some vigilante justice on a shoplifter, but he's also a human, so you can just set Lily free and Vandal can't really do anything about it. Lily doesn't really have anything to add to the whole thin blood thing. Her sire also disappeared soon after her embrace and failed to teach Lily much about her new life. The player's going to have to wait a bit longer for answers on this topic. In the meantime, in the clinic, the player can find a woman dying in one of the consultation rooms. The doctors are too busy to help despite her serious condition, so the player can choose to intervene if they like. Feeding Heather your blood will turn her into a ghoul, and you can send her to hang out in the player's apartment for the rest of the game. Heather is one of many NPCs strategically positioned throughout the game to feed upon without consequence. If someone sees the player conducting vampiric activities in the street, they'll run away in fear, and the player will receive a Masquerade violation. Too many violations will attract hunters who will attack the player on sight, and making 5 total violations causes a game over. Humanity is aware of the existence of vampires. The end is nigh. This is why you can't just feed on random civilians that populate each of the game's hub areas at will. It's important to get consent before you start chomping on throats. Maintaining the Masquerade while still feeding on humans is the strongest realization of the vampire fantasy within Bloodlines that every character will encounter. Remember like 10,000 words ago when that was what we were talking about? The fledgling is powerful, much stronger than a regular human, faster and more magically gifted too, but there isn't much tragedy to their continued existence. The player's sire is immediately executed and they're put right to work, totally disconnected from their previous mortal life. The Samantha character the player encounters in Hollywood supposedly knew the fledgling prior to their embrace, but players don't know who this is and have no reason to care. You actually get an immediate Masquerade violation if at any point you confirm your identity to Samantha, so the player can never know any detail about their life before on death. Now, this sort of works as a removal of the character's original context in the world. They now exist entirely in the vampire layer, and Samantha briefly brings the fledgling back down to regular society. But it's only a single instance, it's vague, and the incentive is to escape the situation without being discovered. Other aspects of the vampire fantasy are left as RPG checks, which is fine. Some vampires are the pretty kind that can seduce their way into a meal, others can command mortals through sheer willpower. Makes sense, I think. The time of day never changes throughout the player's adventures in Los Angeles. The nocturnal nature of vampires is never really addressed throughout the game, not even once, which seems like a missed opportunity to me. Redemption has the player travel through one portion of a dungeon during the daytime, which showed that Nihilistic Software had at least thought about the vampire's aversion to daylight, but Troika never gets around to it. Because of this, it's unclear how long the events of the game take to play out. Has it been a month? Or is this the single craziest night to have ever occurred? The apartment functions as a sanctum for the player, but after visiting it once or twice for the quest lines throughout Santa Monica, the only reason to return is to see what Heather is up to and to grab a bite to eat. And once the adventure led me away from Santa Monica, I basically forgot the apartment was even there. The first new area the player visits once the Sabbat business is finished is downtown LA. The thing that struck me when I initially arrived here was how lively the hub seemed compared to Santa Monica. NPCs in Santa Monica mostly just wander around or stand in one place and wait for the player to talk to them. Except for the Doomsayer guy, he's cool. Sorry.
I have seen the face of the demon, and it is excited!
The downtown NPCs are far more varied. There are human gangs active in the area, and they will fight each other from time to time. There's a bunch of people in hazmat suits standing around, and Fat Larry rules.
I am the proprietor and salesman of the month several years in a row. The ladies call me, oh God, but you can call me Fat Larry with a F-A-T, cause there's more of me to love.
Downtown is also where LaCroix's office is, and it's where the local anarchs hang out. And there's a secret Tremere reliquary if neither of the game's major factions appeal. The Sabbat aren't too happy with the fledglings' actions in Santa Monica, and the player is ambushed the moment they set foot in downtown for the first time. Fortunately, Nines shows up to save the player a grisly death, and remind them that he exists. The animation and sound design in the scene is a bit shit, but I think it does make the player feel indebted to Nines effectively enough, and will likely cause the player to side with the Anarchs on their first playthrough, if Jack wasn't incentive enough already. Picking a side doesn't really matter until the game's final moments, but it is possible to piss Nines and LaCroix off enough that they will refuse to talk to the player for the rest of the game. It's funny that you can do this, but it also softlocks Bloodlines, since now none of the major quest givers will talk to you. I managed to get locked out of the Anarch path while exploring dialogue options during my Malkavian playthrough, which was fine. I wasn't planning on siding with Nines this time around anyway. But the thing the fledgling said didn't seem like it would evoke that kind of reaction. I can't imagine how difficult it would be to follow along if you picked Malkavian for your first playthrough. But regardless of who the player intends to side with, the game requires the player to nominally side with LaCroix at this moment to learn about the Jankerade sarcophagus and its role to play throughout the rest of the game. A Norwegian archaeologist named Dr. Ingvar Johansen had discovered an ancient Assyrian tomb, and found the sarcophagus within significant enough to have it transported to LA for further study. The inhabitant of the sarcophagus, King Messerach, had apparently been the ruler of Assyria for over 250 years, which Dr. Johansen finds ridiculous, so the plan was to exhume the body and determine his actual age upon death. Moreover, the sarcophagus isn't simply held shut by the weight of the stone laid on top. It featured a complex locking mechanism that could only be opened with a specific and unusual key, and the doctor had plans to examine and analyze the mechanics of the lock for further study as well. The vampire leadership in the city believe Messerach to be an antediluvian, and each of the more powerful organizations is making an effort to get their hands on the Jankerade sarcophagus and the key, and claim the prize within. LaCroix sends the player to the Elizabeth Dane to scout if the sarcophagus is there, and aboard the Dane, the player has to start making good use of their stealth and combat capabilities. The boat is swarming with guards, whose patrols and lines of sight make unaugmented sneaking basically impossible. Additionally, LaCroix doesn't want the ship to draw too much media attention, so the player is greatly encouraged to stay their hand whenever possible. There is a wrench to throw around to distract the guards while moving between hiding places, but I didn't find it effective enough to be worth using. In order to get to the sarcophagus, the player either needs to upset LaCroix with a large body count, become truly invisible as they sneak toward the objective, or they can run really fast. The gameplay of infiltrating the Elizabeth Dane does allow some player expression to manifest, but unlike the Sabbat warehouse, commitment to a particular playstyle now becomes necessary. And unfortunately, picking the wrong style at this point will have disastrous consequences later in the game, but we'll talk about that when we get there. For now, LaCroix is pleased to have confirmation of the Jankerade sarcophagus's presence on the ship, and begins formulating a plan to get his hands on it. In the meantime, the player can turn their attention to the outbreak of a mysterious disease affecting the local human population, or they can head over to investigate the disappearance of the city's Malkavian primogeny. While the politics of the highly localized pandemic are interesting, the plunge into Alistair Grout's Malkavian funhouse begins an unfortunate trend that only worsens as Bloodlines continues. Grout is the most senior Malkavian in all of Los Angeles, and unlike the other members of his clan, Grout is lucid and comprehensible. Somehow he has avoided succumbing to the clan's signature madness, and so he uses his home to house and study other Malkavian vampires, in hopes of discovering a cure for not only their mental illness, but perhaps even vampirism itself. Grout had been an accomplished psychiatrist in life, so it was inevitable that he would eventually encounter a Malkavian vampire and be embraced. There are a number of tape recordings voiced by Grout scattered throughout his home that are phenomenally written and performed, and they eventually culminate in the reason for Grout's disappearance. The player will come across a staked skeleton in a bed, presumably belonging to Grout, and when they advance to the room beyond, they will have their first encounter with the vampire hunter Grunfeld Bach, who has set the house on fire. Depending on how many side quests the player is completing, Grout's Mansion could be the player's fourth excursion into one of these combat-focused sub-areas. Much like the Ocean House Hotel, there is a linear path to the objective with some light puzzles, a bunch of enemies, nobody to speak to, and nowhere to use potentially door-opening skills like hacking or lockpicking. This is criticism, weak criticism, I feel, because thoroughly searching for something is a linear process. And sometimes there are obstacles in your way that won't move, even if you ask nicely. But Bloodlines has made talking to people a central component of the gameplay. Troika picked an engine that would make face-to-face conversations look as good as possible, and let the player put points into skills that would alter the way the conversations play out, at the cost of neglecting their character's combat capabilities. To then regularly shove the player into combat gauntlets seems antithetical to the previously free-form role-playing choices, and it invalidates a lot of character development options. These combat sub-areas get more frequent as Bloodlines winds to a conclusion, and the quantity of enemies gets greater and greater as we go. By the time the player makes it to Chinatown, the game will be throwing 8 to 10 enemies at the player at once, which is trivial for combat-focused characters, and a chaotic mess for the others. The detailed and characterful conversations largely take a back seat to shootouts and mashing the F key, and boss fights against enemies with a lot of health. The Ming Zhao fight is especially egregious, but before that, we need to go and get sidetracked in Hollywood. See, the Malkavian primogeny wasn't the only one not to attend the meeting. LA's Nosferatu representative was also absent from proceedings. LaCroix knows the reason for his absence though, so it isn't a mystery that the player needs to solve. Instead, they're deployed to Hollywood to get information from the Nosferatu vampires. While the player was investigating Grout's disappearance, the Jankerade sarcophagus had been unloaded from the ship and taken to the Museum of Natural History, where it was subsequently stolen. If anyone friendly to the Camarilla was to know the current whereabouts of the sarcophagus, it could only be gorgeous Gary Golden. The precise location of the Nosferatu hideout is known only to the Nosferatu themselves, but the Baron of Hollywood, Isaac Abrams, does have a means of contacting Gary whenever necessary. Except, they aren't answering his calls at the moment. As with all other major characters in this game, Isaac uses his ability to contact Gary as a lure to have the player complete a task for him. A videotape had been circling the neighborhood recently, leaving the people who had viewed it pretty shaken up, and Isaac wants to know what all the fuss is about. So the player needs to track down a copy and bring it to Isaac. There are a bunch of leads to follow, including a video rental store with the perfect clerk model. The tape is apparently a snuff film in which a woman is chased around a house by a bunch of evil geodudes. Isaac recognizes the house, and the player is sent there to see if they can figure out who created the video. After searching through the house briefly, the player discovers that the Tzimisce are finally here. An elder vampire named Andre had been capturing and mutilating mortals, transforming their bodies into a vast army of mutant creatures and letting them loose throughout the sewers below Hollywood. This is the point in the game where the Sabbat receives a lot of characterization, and it all comes very suddenly. The fledglings' previous encounters with the Sabbat have painted the entire faction as simply the evil vampires, despite what Bertram Tung says. They don't obey the Masquerade, they're not interested in maintaining their humanity, they're violent and stupid, and could quickly bring the entire species to its destruction. And they've been conspicuously absent ever since the player left Santa Monica. Andre brings the whole thing full circle. The Sabbat are also interested in the Ankaran sarcophagus. They believe the Camarilla will open and unwittingly resuscitate the sleeping elder within, bringing about Gehenna, the end of days. Andre's plan is to destroy the body within the coffin and deny any vampire the opportunity to drain the power from it. I think this is a very noble and reasonable goal, but everything else about this guy screams that he's evil. After the player defeats Andre in the basement of the house, they plunge into the sewers on the hunt for the Nosferatu. Filling the sewers with mutants had been Andre's plan to flush the Nosferatu out of hiding, so logic dictates that their secret base must be down there somewhere. This eventually leads to the boss encounter with the Tsumitsu creation, that is immediately followed by tunnels positively overflowing with this same monster. I don't think the intent is to fight the ones in the tunnels. They're supposed to chase the player into a corner with a doorway to even deeper tunnels, but their pathfinding doesn't make them great at chasing anything. I wasn't intending to talk too much about bugs and glitches in this video because they don't feel fair to criticize. Activision didn't give Troika enough time to polish the game, so it was always going to be a bit clunky. I'd argue that the bugs are easy to ignore and don't detract from the game much at all, but if you tend to be less tolerant to jank, then let me show you what might be a deal breaker. NPCs projecting forward when they start walking, hair clipping, pathfinding issues, stance shifting, node graph out of date, rebuilding, AI disabled. The sheriff's coat does this every time you look at him. Romero's sex noises. Eye contact is hard sometimes. The werewolf encounter. I completely forgot about the werewolf. Must have been some kind of trauma response. If you've never seen the werewolf encounter before, watch this. I didn't do anything special, I just walked through a door. Venus's outfit is crazy. Nobody in her club can dance. Actually, the dancing in both of these vampire games is ridiculous. And soon after meeting Venus, she says this.
Blunt, I refuse to fuck that fat misogynistic old man one more time to hold on to the club.
But when we face off with Boris, I'd say he looks alright for a misogynist. And there's a dude in Chinatown who, well...
Hey you! You want your fortune read? You give me $5, I give you secret Chinese enlightenment. Only stupid person not want to know future.
It's a Vampire the Masquerade game. Certain inclusions are necessary to appease brand managers.
Here your lucky numbers. Write down another repeat. Here go. 11, 17, 25, 93, 11, and 62.
A lot of this stuff, the clipping, the stance shifting, the funny dancing, is here because it was 2004 and nobody knew what they were doing. The Troika staff had largely never worked on a 3D game before, and were hurried toward a deadline that they had never planned to hit. The weird creative choices can be funny, but there's an Orientalism rife throughout the latter parts of the game that I'm sure will put some people off.
Gamiyuki desu. I am she, Demon Hunter. I come to this city for the blood of the demon that killed my master. Do not interfere. My revenge will cut through you if it has to.
Vampires spawned from Cain. The Cain. Cain and Abel Cain. And for the last 2 millennia, they have been living and hunting in Europe, North Africa, and a little ways into West Asia, or the region often referred to as the Middle East. The Abrahamic world, historically. This leaves the rest of Africa and Asia out, in a way that doesn't really make sense. So the solution was to introduce another very similar mythological entity, called the Kuei-jin. What the Kuei-jin actually are is hard to determine, at least from conversations with Bloodlines characters. Ming Xiao, the high priestess and functioning leader of the Los Angeles Kuei-jin, is deliberately vague on details about her affliction. She claims that the Kuei-jin awaken with a second breath, returning their bodies to life to serve some sort of greater purpose only known to the person being revived. Sometimes, Kuei-jin must feed on mortal essences to maintain themselves as they seek out their new purpose. But for the most part, they don't feed like vampires do. They seem to be heavily based on the Jiangshi, an undead creature from Chinese mythology. Ming Xiao says that some Kuei-jin rot if exposed to sunlight, which is a typical Jiangshi trait. There are equivalent myths throughout the rest of East Asia, with Japan naming their zombie vampires Kyonshi, and Korea calling theirs Gangshi. The Kuei-jin and the Jiangshi, unlike typical zombies however, cannot reproduce. This gives me another reason to bring up the Forsaken again and justify the many hours I put into WoW Classic while I was writing this video. See? It wasn't all for nothing. Unsatisfied with one conversation about the origins and function of the Kuei-jin species, I decided to purchase a copy of the book that originally introduced them to the world of darkness. Published in 1998, Kindred of the East is a sourcebook for the second edition of Vampire the Masquerade that confirms pretty much everything Ming Xiao tells the player, and frequently uses antiquated phrases like the Orient as a synonym for the Asian continent. It is everything I hoped and feared it would be. According to the book, Kuei-jin are about halfway between a zombie and a vampire. They aren't embraced like the Kindred are, instead the whims of the universe return a Kuei-jin soul to its body to fulfill some purpose. This rarely happens immediately after a mortal's death, and often sufficient time for a burial or cremation passes before the second breath occurs. So the first thing many Kuei-jin have to do upon resurrection is unbury themselves from their grave, or figure out where they've ended up once their ashes reassemble themselves into a body. This is pretty much how the Jiangshi myth goes, they just have a different name in this setting. Since there isn't an embrace, Kuei-jin don't have lineages, clans, or sires, and they don't feel any instinctual camaraderie with other sufferers of their affliction. They also don't obey the Masquerade, nor do they have an equivalent mandate. The only reason no mortal has sought to eradicate all of the Kuei-jin is because of a general culture of privacy that pervades all of Asia, which seems contrived. Another facet of the continent that both Kindred of the East and Bloodlines seems to forget is, India. It's weird, right? Ming Xiao and the aesthetics of Chinatown have clear East Asian inspiration, but anything south of the Himalayas doesn't make an appearance. It's worse in the book. There's a page for Thailand and a couple paragraphs about Indonesia, which is as close as it gets. There are Indian vampire legends. Seems like a massive missed opportunity to me. If you're inventing fantasy creatures based on mythology, why not draw from one of the most mythologically dense regions in the world? An area filled with countless local legends to draw inspiration from. Instead, we only get one Henga yokai, but he's cool. Once the player finally meets up with Gary, they'll learn that while he does know where the sarcophagus is, he won't part with that information without a favor, much to the fledgling's frustration. A Nosferatu agent deployed to Chinatown hasn't called in for a while, so the player needs to head over there and get the agent back. Mingzhao doesn't know anything about the Nosferatu. Instead, an unrelated mortal who calls himself the Mandarin has Barabbas locked up. The Mandarin seems to be an independently wealthy scientist of sorts, and not only has he learned of the existence of vampires, but he has constructed a rather elaborate series of test chambers to put the fledgling through once they fall for his trap. The gameplay objective in a number of these chambers isn't very clear, but it is interesting to see all of the different anti-vampire myths tested. Naturally, the Mandarin never puts the fledgling in a room full of garlic, since he already knows it's 100% effective. Eventually, the player can break out of the test chambers, kill the Mandarin, and free Barabbas, earning them the location of the Ankaran sarcophagus from Gary. The Giovanni have it. Remember the Giovanni from Redemption 10,000 words ago?
A prolonged firefight would not prove cost-effective.
They're a non-Camarilla, non-Sabbat vampire clan who only embrace humans from within the Giovanni mortal family, which is kind of incestuous when you think about it. They're having a family gathering at their stronghold, which is the perfect opportunity to snoop around without drawing too much attention. This is kind of the last point in the game where conversation skills really mean anything. Well, mean anything in the sense that they can earn you some very minor rewards and let you into the basement a little easier than the normal way. After this, there's 3 or 4 lengthy combat dungeons in a row, so we'd better make the most of the conversations while they last. The mortal members of the Giovanni family are aware of their vampiric elders, and most are itching to be embraced so they can graduate to the upper tiers of the family. Mira, Adam, and Christopher all believe themselves to be next in line to receive the kiss, and each is hoping that tonight is the night. Unfortunately for these 3, they all have shortcomings that the others can use to their advantage, which the player can learn and sell on. It's a shame more couldn't be done with this politicking quest. The player meets the characters in this room, can sell secrets to each of them for a pittance, and will never see them again once they leave. The winner of this exchange, the one who will go on to receive the embrace, is irrelevant. The only person in this room whose trust is worth earning is Nadia. Nadia stumbled upon the Giovanni family crypt and has become fascinated by their walking cadavers. She invites the fledgling to see the crypt, unknowingly granting them access to the Ankaran sarcophagus's hiding place. There's a pair of Quajian operatives guarding the sarcophagus who claim that Mingzhao and LaCroix had formed an alliance, to the exclusion of the other kindred. Their defeat immediately cuts to a movie of the fledgling shoving the stone casket into a box truck and then slowly driving away. The camera reawakens in LaCroix's office, the penthouse of a building that has at least 10 other floors. I'd say the building is much taller, but the elevator only has so many buttons. In the time between leaving the Giovanni house and now, the Ankaran sarcophagus has been transported into this room, a giant sandstone box, to a penthouse suite. Maybe the sheriff strapped it to his back and climbed the exterior of the building. The Giovanni didn't have the key to the sarcophagus, and Beckett's cursory examination hasn't revealed a means of opening it without the key. So, who has the key? Beckett suggests finding Dr. Johansson and asking him about the key. The audio for this conversation was partially bugged when I played, and I guess some of the lines changed between Michael Goff's recording session and the final release. The way he says "Anders" here seems clearly spliced from another take.
His name is Dr. Anders Johansson, a professor of archaeology from Norway.
Beckett knows that the Society of Leopold have abducted Dr. Johansson, and that they have taken him to a monastery in Malibu. Grunfeld Bach knows that the archaeologist is important to the local vampires in some way, and is hoping to draw them into a trap. And he's right. The player must travel to the monastery to rescue Johansson, fighting through swarms of moderately capable vampire hunters before squaring off with the legendary Bach himself. I was fully on the drain 'em out strategy by this point during my first playthrough, and Troika were generous enough to only place a handful of enemies in each combat arena. Amazingly, the monastery is built atop a gigantic cave network that the Society has filled with all kinds of gear for the player to hide behind. Once the fledgling has battled their way through the cave and defeated Bach, they can find and free Dr. Johansson from his captivity. Johansson confirms that the key was stolen separately from the Jankerade sarcophagus, and that it went missing before the Giovanni made their move for the coffin. It seems someone deliberately removed the key to prevent the vampires from having access to King Messerach's body, but it's still unclear who would do that. In the meantime, a small Sabbat contingent led an attack against LaCroix's office in LA, demonstrated by this tiny pile of low-quality rubble. The texture is super low resolution, and it's hard to even tell what these are supposed to be. And the rubble itself doesn't cast any shadows, so it looks like it's floating on top of the street. All of the bodies inside of the lobby fall over once the room loads in. LaCroix is a bit shaken up by the strike, and tasks the player with attacking the Sabbat base in an abandoned hotel just down the street. Beckett's plan for the key is to shrug and assume it'll show up sooner or later. The Sabbat base is a grueling dungeon. At least it was for my boxer character. The player is forbidden from feeding upon other vampires in Bloodlines, so my strategy of draining the enemies to death was resoundingly countered. Also, the hotel is enormous. It took me over an hour to gun all the way through to Andre, with the kitchen area alone absorbing a lot of that time. And you're locked in once you enter the hotel. If you need to leave to buy more ammo or blood bags, you need to reload the last save and fight your way back. The Andre boss battle also took me a fair amount of time to finish. He transforms into this frogman creature and swims around in the blood, before leaping out to attack and then jumping away after receiving enough damage. It isn't a difficult encounter, but it took me way too long to finally get a stun lock going. The room is fabulously grotesque though. Andre has decorated the place with mutilated corpses and big fleshy blobs hidden beneath stretched skin tarps. Where the Ocean House Hotel was kind of quaint and reserved in its horror delivery, this place has abandoned all pretenses and splattered gore all over the walls. Solid arena for a mediocre fight. Andre's final death is extremely popular with the remaining major factions in Los Angeles, and Ming Xiao even meets the player outside to congratulate them on a job well done. She's actually here to tell the fledgling that she has the key to the sarcophagus, and that she and LaCroix conspired to frame Nines for the murder of Alistair Grout, which is a whole side plot I've avoided talking about so far because it isn't overly important. At the end of all this, only one person will walk away with the contents of the Jankerade sarcophagus. Ming Xiao, LaCroix, and Nines will all plead their case before the last dive into the remaining dungeons, and you can still seek out Maximilian Strauss if you want to side with him. Every scenario where the player doesn't side with the Kuei Jin involves killing Ming Xiao, so it's back to Chinatown for another brutal dungeon. Luckily, the player is allowed to feed upon Kuei Jin, but finding opportunities to do so is a bit rough. I appreciate how much better the temple looks compared to the Sabbat Hotel, and the spike traps in the walls are creative if ineffective. It still takes a considerable length of time to get to Ming Xiao's boss encounter room, and backing out midway through is also impossible. Being unable to go and restock is particularly egregious because the fight against Ming Xiao is ridiculous, frankly. Xiao is a master of the Flesh Shintai, a school of Kuei Jin magic that allows the user to alter the shape of their body and detach pieces of themselves to create little homunculi and stuff. The artworks in the Kindred of the East book depicting this are very good. Some properly twisted body horror stuff that brings Amigata Fault to mind. This being in the book kind of legitimizes Xiao transforming into an eldritch squid monster and breaking into smaller pieces as the fight goes on, but it is the second major faction leader in a row that transforms into a non-vampire monster as part of their boss encounter. And I was not well enough equipped to be able to defeat the squid on my first playthrough. Ming Xiao is relentlessly aggressive. She can range the entire arena. There are no obstacles to hide behind, there's no way to kite her around, and she has a truly monstrous health pool. If you manage to cut off one of Zhao's tentacles, it'll sprout into a miniature version of the boss, and if you fail to kill the copy in time, it will grow to full size and join Zhao in beating you down. My boxer character never stood a chance, even after figuring out how to stunlock Zhao with the flamethrower. Fortunately, I was able to cheat my way through this fight to see the rest of the game my first time through, but I'm really disappointed that I had to resort to that. I think these final few boss encounters are Bloodlines' most major shortcoming. Throughout the rest of the game, the player can choose to talk to people, sneak past people, look for alternative routes through areas, or they can pick fights. It is possible to achieve a lot of the game's early goals without killing anybody, and for an RPG, especially one where the player character's morality is in question, a pacifist option is extremely welcome. The player can invest their experience points into skills and abilities that help them avoid combat, but every main quest mandated dungeon after Hollywood ends with a boss encounter that must be defeated. This is a Human Revolution style fumble, except 7 years earlier. And because replayers will know this, experience points received early will always be put into combat attributes, squeezing the player into a combat-only playstyle. Why bother investing in stealth and lockpicking when you already have 5 points in firearms and can easily kill all of the guards in the building? That was exactly how my Malkavian playthrough went. The Malkavian's lines being different are the only thing that makes the conversations interesting the second time through, even though charisma, manipulation, appearance, wits, and any conversation-altering spell disciplines are all right there on the same skill screen. I cannot flirt my way out of a battle with Mingzhao Saron, even if I really wanted to. With Zhao Thulu dead, and the sarcophagus key in hand, or just right away if the fledgling is siding with the Kuei Jin, it's off to Lacroix's tower to see what's inside that big old box. This building becomes a dungeon if the player isn't working with Lacroix, filled with enthralled police and mobster vampires. After climbing a few floors, the player eventually runs into the sheriff, and finally gets to see him in action. Defeating his normal form triggers a second phase, where the sheriff transforms into a giant bat and flies around the rooftops. This is the kind of thing I wanted to see. Vampires turn into bats. There are spotlights on the edge of the arena that the player can use to knock the behemoth out of the sky, which opens him up to get punched, so melee characters at least have some way of dealing damage to the boss. Once his health reaches 0, it's time for the final confrontation with Lacroix. This scene can play out in a bunch of different ways depending on the player's allegiance, and I find that cool and interesting enough to partially smooth over the dungeons and bosses we had to plow through to get here. In 2 of the endings, the Ankaran sarcophagus is never opened. The temptation is ruled far too great by Strauss and Mingzhao, so the coffin is hidden away. Strauss gets his top men to study the sarcophagus, while Zhao dumps it and the player character into the ocean. These endings might seem unsatisfying. The whole game has revolved around the contents of this box, but I think they both do an excellent job of maintaining the mystery and perpetuating the cycle. Some things are too powerful, even for immortal hands, but maybe one day we will be enlightened enough to make good use of that power. In the other 3 endings, the player hands the key to the sarcophagus over to Lacroix and either joins him when it's opened or leaves him to suffer the reveal. Lacroix inserts the key into the mechanism, pushes the lid back, and looks upon his prize. At some point during the game, Jack got his hands on the sarcophagus and the key, and replaced the mummified body with a hefty pile of C4. The final few movies on this path are all the same, but they cut at different moments. I appreciate the effort to squeeze a few extra endings into the game, but this is a little too transparent for my taste. Siding with Lacroix or taking the power for yourself places the fledgling beside him when the bomb explodes, and then immediately cuts to Jack and Messerach's corpse watching the explosion from a distant park. Siding with the Anarchs or going solo plays another movie after the explosion, where the player character is walking away from some debris as Nines runs to them. If the player has rejected Nines, the fledgling pushes through the Anarchs and flips them off as they walk off into the night. But if they're siding with the Anarchs, the movie ends abruptly as the fledgling reaches the group. It's clearly the same animation, they just cut it sooner. This still transitions to Jack watching the explosion while the cab driver closes out the game. These endings are immediately satisfying, at least in a written sense. We get to see LaCroix's scheming literally blow up in his face. We also get to see the actual contents of the Ankaran sarcophagus, both before and after Jack tampered with it. I don't feel as much gratification as the other endings provide though. It's fun that the villain loses, and you get to lose too if you take one of the more selfish paths. But it isn't clear if Masquerade is benign, or if Jack is watching fireworks with an actual apocalyptic catalyst. We can deem LaCroix unworthy of ultimate power, but was he even going to get it in the first place? And this thing the cab driver says,
"Remember, wherever we go, it is the blood of Cain which makes our fate."
Does that mean the events were preordained? Is the driver retroactively claiming the whole plot of the game was already decided, and that because the fledgling is a vampire, they don't have free will? The game has largely been about making choices, right? Isn't this conclusion by the driver nonsense? At the start of this video, I said I wanted to figure out how a game like Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines could possibly have the glowing reputation that it does. The game didn't review too well at release, it had a notoriously difficult development, and it sold so poorly that the studio who made it ceased operations shortly after shipping it. There's a bunch of glitches and jank that were enough for people to write Bloodlines off completely. Why would a bunch of modern developers cite this game as a major source of inspiration? The reason is, while Troika's game does have a bunch of obvious blemishes, the aspects that are done well are unlike any other video game. Foremost among these aspects is the game's phenomenal writing. Every character is unique and complex, with opinions about current events and other people. The writers had meticulously planned out identities for each character in the game, planned out what information they could know, and then had those characters make logical conclusions with that information that backs up their identity. Beckett is a neutral entity. He only cares about cold, factual information, which makes him come across as a little heartless at times. Damsel, on the other hand, is all heart. These two juxtapose each other tremendously, and every other character in the game gets the same treatment. And to then make these characters interact with the Malkavian fledgling is a feat of brilliance. There aren't many games that give the player the number of choices that Bloodlines provides. While immersive sim games are typically constructed around player freedom and expression, the number of these games that are true sandboxes is fairly low. And while I'd argue Bloodlines isn't quite there, it gets pretty close. Successfully navigating a conversation or a room full of enemies can mean a lot of different things to a bunch of different characters, and the variety of permutations leads everyone to their own individual playthroughs. And a lot of what can be done is true to the source material. Bloodlines is shockingly faithful to the Vampire the Masquerade role-playing game. The vast majority of decision points in Bloodlines are things that players would have to decide on while sitting at the table. What to say in conversation, how to attempt to resolve a hostile encounter, even down to the way combat operates and what sort of abilities enemies could possess. It is a very thorough approximation. This isn't unique to Bloodlines. Dungeons & Dragons video games were also very consistent in this way, but the other adaptations of World of Darkness games varied quite a lot when it came to representing the source material. And of course, Bloodlines nails almost all of the vampire fantasy criteria we set out earlier. While I argued that the tragedy of the fledgling's undeath isn't achieved, the player character is powerful. They have been excised from their mortal existence and regular society, and their decline into monstrosity is always a threat. The Masquerade is an important component of the player's regular interactions with the game too, and the clan the fledgling hails from, their literal bloodline, has massive sway on the moment-to-moment gameplay as well. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines might be the greatest vampire simulator to ever exist, and there's only one real candidate that could supplant it. So that's it, right? We covered the tabletop game, both video game adaptations, and I only got a little sidetracked in the middle. That should be it. Well, I'm not the only one that thought Bloodlines was a notable game. There are doubtless hundreds of people active in the games industry nowadays whose work is in some way influenced by Bloodlines, consciously or unconsciously, and even some who specifically reference Troika's game when questioned in interviews. In the interest of making this video as definitive as possible, and because I don't think I'll ever get around to writing the individual videos for the games I'm about to talk about, I think it'd be a good idea to look at some prominent examples to show just how influential Bloodlines has been. The poor sales and reception of Bloodlines at release chilled all interest in World of Darkness video game adaptations for the better part of 15 years. Game development had become very expensive, and the production time required to realize the true scope of another Vampire the Masquerade game would be much too long. Similarly, lengthy, slow-burn narrative adventures had largely fallen out of favor with a valued portion of the game-playing audience. Company executives were reluctant to approve projects that had no chance of appealing to the Call of Duty crowd, and it would fall to the indie developers to fulfill that niche. Adults who had played Bloodlines when they were younger were keen to bring their favorite parts of their beloved game back in a major way, and so a number of visual novels sprang forth throughout 2019 and 2020. Clearly, the setting and storytelling aspect of Bloodlines was what draw distance and choice of games valued most, and the people who like those sort of games seem to think that Coteries of New York is pretty good. I like to play the odd adventure game every now and then, but visual novels just don't appeal to me at all, so I can't really agree. Similarly narrative-focused is Vampire the Masquerade Heartless Lullaby, a Vampire Jam entry made by Entalto Studios in 2021. The game recounts the night that ruined Zach Riley's life forever by inducting him into the city's supernatural underworld. It is a surprisingly solid mini-RPG adventure that managed to win the competition and earn Paradox's endorsement. Entalto left Vampire Jam with the go-ahead to develop a properly licensed, full-length game. Heartless Lullaby is a Game Jam project, so it isn't the most robust or polished title, but as a super early vertical slice, I think there's a lot of potential here, and I am eager to play Heartless Symphony if it ever ships. Another game with a dubious release date is Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2. When Paradox Interactive acquired White Wolf back in 2015, a lot of people speculated that the publisher would greenlight a Bloodlines sequel in order to reinvigorate interest in the World of Darkness franchise. In 2019, Paradox entered talks with Seattle-based video game developer Hardsuit Labs about a Bloodlines sequel, who quickly brought Brian Mitsoda back on board. The project was knocked back a couple of times, with Paradox taking umbrage with the way the game was shaking out. Eventually, Paradox decided to cancel their partnership with Hardsuit Labs completely and move Bloodlines 2 over to the Chinese room in 2021. In an interview with GamesIndustry.biz, Paradox Deputy CEO Mattia Lilja said that the publisher was doubtful Hardsuit Labs could produce the game they felt Bloodlines 2 needed to be. It has been 4 years since the Chinese room took over the project, and 6 years since Bloodlines 2 entered development, but the game is apparently due to release in October. I wish them all the best. Vampire the Masquerade isn't the only World of Darkness RPG to receive a video game adaptation. Werewolf the Apocalypse, Hunter the Reckoning, and Wraith the Oblivion have all been licensed to video game developers over the years, and the resulting games have received varying degrees of popularity and acclaim. The first of these, released in 2002 for Xbox and GameCube, is simply titled Hunter the Reckoning. It's the first in a trilogy of hack-and-slash games in which the player is cast as a hunter, a human imbued by a traumatic event, giving them the power to see the true nature of the world. Each of the 4 playable characters in the first game receives their imbuement when the execution of serial killer Nathaniel Arcady goes awry. Suddenly, they can see how prevalent the supernatural is, and they become determined to eradicate it all. Conceptually, this is an extreme departure from the vampire games, but in this context, I think it works well. Vampires and werewolves are monsters, and the writer needs to expend some effort to get the player to sympathize with them. Regular humans should already have a player's sympathies, so the writer needs to go the other way to make the hunters appear more villainous, or at least more disagreeable. We know vampires are people. We also know they hold a lot of power over us. So there's a callousness and a conviction that is necessary for a regular person to be able to stand a chance. This is illustrated best by a Wraith character early on.
This is Kaylee. Get her to the church. Her parents are waiting. Typical. I try to help you, and this is the thanks I get. You think I can't see you shaking at the other end of that barrel? Do you think I don't know that your brain is trying to process the horrible fact that, oh my God, it talks? And if it talks, it thinks. And you can't stand that, can you? When are you going to learn that you're not hunters? You're sheep with shotguns. You don't want me for your enemy, so take the help.
The Wraith knows that the hunters hold prejudice against all supernatural beings, even if the monsters are so in name only. He talks about how, despite their imbuement, the hunters still basically know nothing of the supernatural underworld, that they hate it because they don't understand it, and that lack of understanding will be their downfall. It isn't the best written plea for cooperation, but I found it compelling enough for the setting to think of it positively. The twin-stick shooter gameplay isn't anything special, but this speech has kind of piqued my interest. I think I'll be playing this trilogy in the future. The first non-text adventure adaptation of Werewolf the Apocalypse, subtitled Earthblood, was developed by Cyanide Studios and released in February of 2021. Earthblood is an action RPG in a similar vein to Bloodlines, but with a much greater focus on the action component. The narrative revolves around Kahal and a ragtag crew of Garu operatives fighting to oust the evil company Endron from their home in rural Washington. They pronounce it Endron to try and make adding a single letter to Enron a little less blatant, but that is what the company is called in the source material.
The best way to get Endron out of the region is to attack their bottom line.
The gameplay is split between 2 distinct segments. The first half of most levels involves sneaking around in human or wolf form, avoiding guards and cameras whilst heading towards an objective. And then, upon being discovered, Kahal unleashes his werewolf form, and the game becomes a hack and slash that reminds me of Marlowe Briggs. This gameplay juxtaposition also reminds me of another thing. So, here's the criteria we'll be applying to decide if this is a good werewolf game or not. Nah, I get the impression that Cyanide wanted to make a stealth action game and figured the license was a good fit for their plan. There is very little role-playing in this adaptation of a tabletop RPG. Sure, you can choose what you want Kahal to talk about in some conversations, and there are points to assign to ability upgrades, but that's the extent of it. There's the walking around the home base stuff, and then there's the infiltrating the enemy facility stuff. I have mixed opinions on the primary gameplay loop, and there are some writing disappointments that are kind of bothersome to me, but I think the largest hurdle most players will have to cross is Earthblood's presentation. The textures are phenomenal. The whole game looks crisp and detailed, from the large structures all the way down to the pores and little scars on Kahal's arm. But the model and animation quality is really not up to the same standard. The Kahal and Rodko models look fine, but all of the other humans with talking parts are uncanny wooden dolls. Their facial expressions never change. The lip syncing makes it look like everyone is talking through their teeth, and all of the other animations are jerky and uncomfortable. I've never seen somebody shrug and it looks so unnatural before. This has been an issue with Cyanide's games for a long time, and it's frustrating to see that they haven't been able to improve the animation quality. Each level tasks the player with infiltrating an end-run facility on the hunt for a computer terminal. These facilities consist of a series of stealth challenge rooms, filled with guards, cameras, and obstacles to hide behind. The objective for these is mainly to reach the door at the other side, but that can vary. Cahal is a highly efficient killer while in human form, able to take most guards down with a single button press. Rooms with cameras usually have a control terminal nearby to deactivate them, and every room will have a number of yellow reinforcement doors that can be sabotaged to help out if the player is ever discovered. Upon taking the first point of damage, Cahal will burst into his werewolf form, and the player will need to kill all of the hostile NPCs in the room before being allowed to proceed. Additional waves of enemies spawn from the reinforcement doors, and sabotaging them damages those enemies on entry. The quantity of enemy types is solid, and more are regularly introduced as the game goes on. Shotgunners, snipers, riot gear and cattle prods eventually give way to huge exosuits, combat drones, and science magically enhanced super soldiers. Those super soldiers are then followed up by most of the previous enemies being remixed in some way through evil worm magic, which I found to be a positive surprise. The variety of enemies don't do much to change up the hack and slash gameplay though, so I resolved to be as stealthy as possible, which is a more engaging challenge. Narratively, Earthblood isn't trying anything special, but the lore implementation is fun. Cahal has a daughter who has infiltrated Endron and is working to dismantle what she can from the inside, and the werewolves, backed up by a mortal organization named Lambda Mankind, do their best to support her efforts. Endron has been in the process of developing a biofuel in an attempt to greenwash the company's atrocious environmental reputation, and it turns out that the project is much more sinister than it first appears. I do like the way Endron's greenwashing campaign is portrayed. It's very cynical and performative. They wrap plastic branches around the company logo and put pictures of flowers and wind turbines on the walls of their fracking facility. A lot of what the company actually does seems comically evil, like cartoonish villainy. But compared to the actual Enron, it's all par for the course. Seriously, we've kind of forgotten about the private armies and environmental catastrophes, and we only half remember the sketchy financial stuff. I think it's a strong enough motivator for most players to see the game through, but the gameplay is one note and repetitive enough to bounce people. And the alien weaponry song was working so hard to draw people in too. Another action RPG starring a supernatural being is Don't Nod Entertainment's 2018 game, Vampyr. Players embody Dr. Jonathan Reed as he struggles to come to grips with his new life as a vampire, and works to cure the outbreak of the Spanish flu in London. Like Earthblood, Vampyr has an action focus, but it goes to greater lengths to include more meaningful role-playing elements. Conversation is a far more important component of Vampyr, despite none of the unlockable skills affecting it in any way. Instead, what the player says and what the player does throughout their adventure determines various outcomes as the game goes on. Vampyr applies all of our vampire media criteria tremendously, and it's probably the best rendition of the vampire fantasy available in video game form. Upon returning to London from military deployment in Europe, Reed is bitten by a vampire and transformed. Some time passes between embrace and his reawakening, and in his first moments of consciousness post-death, Reed attacks and drains all of the blood from Mary, his own sister. This is a suitable tragedy that haunts Reed throughout the game. Filled with guilt and confusion, Reed chooses to avoid his own sickly mother and is instead coerced into working as a physician in an East London hospital, providing a point of sympathetic contact with humanity, but also providing a place to hunt. His role at the hospital is even pitched as an opportunity to learn more about the vampiric condition. So, clearly, Reed has the opportunity to be a monster, but he would be an unwilling one. The player's impact on the communities in this part of London is also a major gameplay system that provides incentive to not immediately feed on every NPC Reed comes across. The more the player learns about a person, the more experience they will receive if they choose to feed upon that character. But killing named NPCs, or allowing them to die from sickness, can lead to drastic consequences that don't just change which ending the player receives, but also makes moving around the city more dangerous. Squads of vampire hunters and a variety of aggressive vampires will begin patrolling previously safe streets, attacking the player and generally killing the vibe, so the player is forced to choose. Will the good doctor help the city and keep everyone safe, or will he feed upon the people under his care and cast London to the fiends? And it isn't anywhere near a binary choice. The world is in motion. People act on their own interest when the player isn't around, and can cause major upheavals to the region at any moment. Sean Hampton runs a shelter for the homeless and starving in the Docks region, a place the locals refer to as the Night Asylum. Sean is a pious and charitable man who the player meets as he is being attacked by a Skal-turned resident of his asylum. Sean sustains minor injuries, but Reed and Dr. Swansea carry Sean to the hospital to oversee his recovery. Partway through the game, Sean suddenly flees Pembroke without warning, leaving a massive pool of blood in his wake. Reed is sent to track him down and to learn what caused such a violent scene at the hospital. When the player finally tracks Sean down, they learn that he has been transformed into a Skal vampire himself, although he doesn't appear to be a vicious, mindless monster like all of the others the player has encountered so far. Sean asks Reed to trust him, and sends the player into the sewers to find a hidden refuge occupied by more sentient Skal vampires. After learning of the humanity that still exists within some Skal vampires, the player may pass judgment on Sean. He appears to be an important piece of the community within the Docks. Without him, the people living in the asylum will have nowhere to go, and he seems lucid and strong. He even promises to only eat the flesh of the already deceased. I chose to trust Sean. Reed had many opportunities to become a monster, but had thus far managed to avoid succumbing to his instincts. And Sean seemed to possess far more conviction than Reed ever displayed. After some other events, I checked the citizen menu to see if anyone had fallen ill, and noticed that Sean and 3 other characters from the Docks were listed as missing. 4 white exclamation points had also appeared on the map, so I travelled to the Night Asylum to find out what was going on. In my absence, Sean's conviction had failed. He had attempted to convince the local drunk, Dyson Delaney, to quit the drink and try to turn his life around. Delaney refused, preferring to bask in self-destruction, as a note Sean had written puts it. This infuriated Sean, and in his rage, Sean capitulated to the Skal's infectious madness. Those who could fled the asylum. Everyone else was massacred. This all stemmed from my choice. Had I not trusted Sean, had I learned more about the disease, many people might have survived. But the consequences of distrusting Sean could have been equally destructive. This is where Vampyr shines the most. Strong characterization, difficult and impactful decisions, and a frightening degree of uncertainty. It is not what many conversations about this game seem most concerned with, however. The common consensus on Vampyr seems to be that the narrative is very good, and the combat is mediocre to bad. I don't agree, in either case. Combat functions in a similar way to Bloodborne of all games. Reed can quickstep and parry, he can wield a two-handed weapon or a one-hander and a pistol, the player can carry blood vials around for healing, and aggressively attacking an enemy often results in health returning if the fight is played correctly. Reed cannot perform backstabs and visceral attacks, but enemies do have a visible posture bar that, when depleted, opens them up to a high damage bite. Even bosses have this posture bar, allowing the player to see when they should get aggressive for staggers and blood refills. There is also a rock paper scissors style weakness system that shows the player which weapon style an enemy resists and which style deals additional damage, encouraging the player to switch weapons and make use of Reed's trove of magical attacks. I think the system falters a bit when fighting multiple enemies. I also think Don't Nod failed to recognize this, because the vast majority of combat encounters in this game are not one-on-ones. But the magical abilities the player can level into should help to mitigate getting swarmed. If the player is choosing not to embrace NPCs for experience, then the scaling will seem intense at times, but that is a consequence of the player's choice. They made the game harder for themselves. Unlike Bloodlines, the choice to feed unnamed NPCs to get experience is always available, and if the player wants, they can reclaim all spent experience in order to redo their build as desired. New weapons can be a bit hard to come by at times, but if the player does find a loadout they enjoy, they can use the readily available upgrade materials to scale their weapons as the game progresses. It isn't an easy game, unless the player selects the easy mode at game start, but I think that's fine. As for the narrative, the presentation and lack of a real villain are my two major issues. In a similar vein to Earthblood, the details are fascinating, but the way people talk, the way they are animated, and the moment-to-moment objectives are poor. Vampyr is set in London in 1918. The vernacular, while still being British English, is different than it is today. That being said, the language characters use in dialogue is often unnatural.
Please excuse my agitated state. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't let anyone see me in this condition.
I must confess I have not put an end to the blackmail, my lady. Unfortunately, I could not bring myself to do it.
I'm so disappointed in you, Jonathan. I didn't expect this from you.
Lady Ashbury, you yourself admitted how ridiculous the sum of money was. I can assure you, it was all used for charitable ends.
It's formal in a way that isn't necessary, and then it isn't. The tone is consistent, but the subject of conversation isn't. Why is the ransom for blackmail an admission of a ridiculous sum of money? And why is that acceptable when used for charitable ends? These two sentences don't make sense when placed back to back like this. And this kind of thing crops up all the time. Similarly, the voice direction is atrocious. You can hear certain actors going to the next line sometimes.
In this matter is eclipsed only by my shame at having put the hospital at risk.
Whomever voiced Dr. Reed was also never told the context of the line he is reading.
It's just horrible. Some say the sewer dog is back.
The sewer dog?
The sewer dog? What's that?
Sometimes two sentences that continue the same idea have different inflections, or the actor emphasizes the wrong part of the statement.
There's a lot we're not seeing here, but it is spreading, and quickly. If we don't act, the whole city could be lost.
It sounds like me directing myself. Just contextless text read aloud, back to back, with hopes that it'll come together in the edit. The camera is usually pointed at whomever Reed is speaking with, and the player gets to watch them wobble around throughout conversation. It's an attempt to make them seem more natural, but I think it looks more uncanny than anything else. People don't just idly jiggle around while speaking. Their hands might move, they might adjust their seating or standing position. They break direct eye contact and they physically express more. Vampyr characters break eye contact with Reed only to stare into the camera, which makes it seem like they know who they're really talking to. Similarly, nobody's eyelids or brows ever move, and some characters have a rigid, plasticky lower lip. Many female NPCs clasp their hands together when speaking with Reed, exacerbating the robotic, expressionless look even more. I don't mean to pick on Lady Ashbury specifically, but everything about her presentation is a mess.
I must say I'm shocked, Jonathan.
You sure look it. The scene where she and Reed talk in front of a fireplace is framed well. I think the intention here was good. It at least had something visually distinct from all of the other conversations in the game. But when the models look like they're sliding into keyframes like this, it ends up looking uncomfortable. This scene could have been mocapped for all I know. I just don't like how the characters move. Do Life is Strange characters look this awkward? Otherwise, Vampyr's presentation is fantastic. The streets are moody and sinister. The flu is visually very present and threatening. There's a lot of clutter that helps make the city feel alive, but nobody's around right now because of the hour. This game was made in Unreal Engine 4, so the lighting and weather effects are solid, and the ever-present haze accentuates those assets very well. The soundtrack is phenomenal too. Using only cello and flutes is bold, but the score is expertly arranged, and the recording quality adds a richness to the soundscape that would be hard to replicate with digital instruments.
Morbidity can bring its own beauty and grace.
Who are you? You who dared enter my realm? Are you here to worship or mock me?
I'm here to put an end to the vampire epidemic, Miss Fletcher.
Ah. But Doris Fletcher is no more.
There's an intensity in the midtones that I don't think I've ever experienced before. Vampyr's narrative has two major objectives. The first and most pressing is to find a cure for the flu. Reed was an army surgeon who earned public notoriety off the back of a blood transfusion technique he developed prior to the war. He is never depicted as having any kind of virological understanding, but it's a fantastical disease that turns people into vampires, so expertise is basically irrelevant. Fine. The player's second goal is to figure out the identity of Reed's vampiric sire. None of the vampires Reed can speak with have any idea who his sire might be, but Reed's potent vampiric power would indicate that whoever did sire him would be unfathomably powerful themselves. Once in a while, Reed will see a floating red apparition who seems mysterious enough to be the vampire in question. This figure brings apocalyptic premonitions and urges Reed to figure out a way to stop it, but only vaguely. Reed has a bit of a disdain for being told what to do, despite his military experience. And his primary issue with these visions is that he wishes his sire wasn't so bossy. Reed's sire is ultimately unimportant. He was simply fortunate enough to notice that Reed was a doctor, and figured Reed would eventually find a means to defeat the disease. I won't fully spoil the source of the vampire epidemic, because I think the game does an effective job setting it all up, but I do think Harriet Jones could have done with some more screen time. She ends up being a very important character, with pieces of her characterization being main plot relevant, and we only talk to Harriet a couple of times throughout the game. The epilogue is hot garbage, and can actually go for about 30 minutes if you don't skip some of the superfluous dialogue options. The extra layer of detail about why Lady Ashbury's blood is specifically evil isn't important. I would have been much happier with a Jurassic Park style moral ending, where humanity should remember that ethics are important, because in the end, that is what this game has been about. People with terrible power holding it over the heads of the vulnerable for their own personal gain. Reed needs to tend to the health of the NPCs in the game so that he can learn about their lives, and then the player may leverage their secrets for sweet EXP drops. and Dr. Swansea, Lady Ashbury, Lord Redgrave, Aloysius Dawson, and Camellia, most sinister of all, they're all doing the same. In an interview with Area Yogones, published in April of 2019, Mateusz Tomoskowicz, quest director of Cyberpunk 2077, named Bloodlines as his strongest source of inspiration for the project. Specifically, Tomoskowicz cited the non-linearity and dialogue as things he was trying to capture within Cyberpunk's quests. Unfortunately, I can't record Cyberpunk gameplay on my PC, so I won't be able to show examples of where I think CD Projekt achieved Tomoskowicz's aim, but examples are there. A great early point would be the player's response to Victor asking for payment. V receives an upgrade, a tutorial about the body modification system, and some anti-rejection medication from the Ripperdoc, and all of that should cost around 21,000 eddies. The player could have that amount of money by this stage and be able to pay Victor his fee, but it's far more likely they won't. The only reason the player would have this money this early is because they farmed for it specifically, their Malkavian foreknowledge swerving the debt when the mandatory upgrade tutorial comes at a cost. Upsettingly, Tomoskowicz asks the interviewer if they've ever heard of Bloodlines before going into detail about which aspects he had taken inspiration from, which makes me nervous about this whole thing. Maybe I shouldn't have bothered trying to be thoughtful about stuff, and should have just made a video about decorative utility poles or abandoned multiplayer games or, like, empty parts of open worlds. Or I can hope someday my work will be recognized in retrospect. At this stage, it's clear that Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines has had a sizable impact on modern video games in a way that will continue for the foreseeable future. Not only have the components of the video game itself been used for inspiration and iterated upon, but even the business practices that were so self-destructive have been largely discarded in favor of more sustainable methodologies. Troika Games toiled and struggled to create something groundbreaking, and while audiences at the time weren't overly receptive to their product, the players who did pay attention have learned from Troika's hardships. And I think laying it all out like this could help other developers avoid those pitfalls too. As for whether following Bloodlines' lead will assist in earning a cult fanbase for modern games, so far I don't think I've seen anything conclusive. Heartless Lullaby and Heartless Symphony haven't made any waves at all. Werewolf the Apocalypse Earthblood is firmly a middle-of-the-pack title that will likely fade into obscurity as it ages. And Cyberpunk 2077 was made by one of the most popular developers in the industry right now, so it'll probably just be regularly successful and not an underground darling. Vampyr might be the best candidate here, although it may never shake its middling reputation. Will these games achieve immortality? Did they feed upon the vampyre's blood? Will their ideas be remembered long after they fade into becoming retro deep cuts? Will I be able to stomach talking about vampires again when Bloodlines 2 comes out? All of that may only be answered in time. Thanks for watching.